In the autumn of 1256, the largest army the world had ever seen descended upon a mountain fortress that had defied empires for 166 years. The Mongol commander Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan, and brother to the great Khan Mungke, had brought with him siege engineers from China, catapult specialists from Persia, and 1,000 battalions of horsemen, whose combined numbers darkened the valleys below the Alborz Mountains like a tide of black water rising toward an impossible summit. The fortress they had come to destroy was called Alamut, a name that meant eagle's nest in the Persian tongue, and it perched upon a rock so sheer and so narrow that the chroniclers who described it claimed that a single stone dropped from its walls would fall for the length of time it took a man to recite a complete prayer before striking the ground below. For generations, the rulers of the Islamic world had sent army after army against this fortress and the network of castles that spread outward from it, like the strands of a spider's web across the mountains of Persia and Syria. And for generations those armies had returned broken, their commanders assassinated in their tents, their soldiers terrified by rumours of invisible killers who could penetrate any guard and strike any target regardless of the protection that surrounded them. The order that held Alamut had killed viziers in their own courts, sultans in their own palaces, and crusader kings in the churches where they knelt to pray, and they had done so with such theatrical precision that witnesses often reported the killers making no attempt to escape, standing calmly over their victims' bodies while guards rushed forward to cut them down, dying with expressions of perfect serenity, as if the act of murder and the act of martyrdom were aspects of a single sacred duty that transcended the boundary between life and death itself. The name by which these killers would eventually be known to the world was the Hashashin, a term that European crusaders would carry back to their homelands and transform into the word assassin, a word that would enter every major European language as the designation for political murder, committed through stealth and infiltration rather than open warfare. The transformation of this single Arabic term into a universal European concept represented something more than linguistic borrowing, for it reflected the genuine terror that the Order of Assassins had inspired across the medieval world, a terror so complete that it reshaped the way both Islamic and Christian civilizations understood the relationship between political power and targeted killing. Before the rise of the Hashashin, political murder was certainly practiced throughout the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, but it was understood primarily as a crime, an act of desperation or treachery that violated the norms of legitimate political competition. After the Hashashin, political assassination became something else entirely, a recognised form of warfare that could be practiced systematically by an organisation possessing the discipline to train killers over the course of years and the ideological conviction to send those killers to certain death in pursuit of objectives that serve the organisation's long-term strategic interests. The Order of Assassins invented, or at least perfected, a form of violence that would echo through subsequent centuries in organisations as diverse as the anarchist cells of 19th century Europe, the political wings of 20th century revolutionary movements, and the terrorist networks of the contemporary world, making the history of this medieval Persian sect far more than an exotic curiosity from the distant past, and transforming it instead into one of the foundational chapters in the development of modern political violence. Yet the organisation that Hulagu Khan's forces were descending upon in that autumn of 1256 was not merely a network of killers, nor was it primarily defined by the spectacular murders that had made its name synonymous with terror throughout the Islamic and Christian worlds. The Hashashin were first and foremost a religious movement, an offshoot of the Ismaili branch of Shia Islam that had developed its own distinctive theology, its own hierarchy of spiritual knowledge, and its own vision of how the faithful should live in a world dominated by unjust rulers who had usurped authority that rightfully belonged to the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad. The founder of the order, a Persian scholar and missionary named Hassani Sabah, had seized the fortress of Alamut not to create a guild of murderers, but to establish a sanctuary where his particular interpretation of Ismaili doctrine could be practiced without interference from the Sunni authorities who controlled the major cities of the Islamic world. The murders that would make his organisation famous were, from Hassan's perspective, merely one instrument among several that could be employed to protect his community from its enemies and advance its religious mission, and the men who carried out those murders were not criminals or mercenaries, but religious devotees who believed that their actions served the highest purposes of divine justice. Understanding the order of assassins therefore requires understanding the theological framework that animated its members, the historical circumstances that gave rise to that theology, and the way in which religious conviction and practical necessity combined to produce an organization unlike any that had existed before in the Islamic world. The story of the Hashashin begins not in the mountains of Persia, but in the theological disputes that had fractured the Islamic community since the death of the Prophet Muhammad in 632 CE. Disputes that would eventually produce the fundamental division between Sunni and Shia Islam that shapes the religious geography of the Middle East to the present day. The question at stake in these disputes was essentially one of succession, specifically the question of who possessed the legitimate authority to lead the Muslim community after Muhammad's death, and the answer to this question depended upon whether one believed that leadership should pass through election by the community's most respected members or through hereditary descent from the Prophet himself. Those who accepted the authority of the elected caliphs who followed Muhammad became known as Sunnis, taking their name from the concept of sunnah, or traditional practice, while those who believed that leadership should have passed directly to Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, became known as Shia, a term derived from the phrase Shi'at Ali, or Party of Ali. The Shia position was that Muhammad had explicitly designated Ali as his successor before his death, that the community had wrongfully passed over this designation in favour of the elected caliphs, and that the legitimate leadership of Islam remained with the descendants of Ali and his wife Fatima, the Prophet's daughter, through whom the bloodline of the Prophet continued into subsequent generations. The early centuries of Islamic history witnessed a series of violent confrontations between Sunni and Shia factions, confrontations that produced martyrs whose deaths became foundational to Shia religious consciousness, and grievances whose memory shaped Shia political thought for centuries to come. The most significant of these martyrdoms occurred at the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE, where Hussein ibn Ali, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad and the third figure whom the Shia recognized as Imam or rightful leader of the community, was killed along with most of his family and supporters by the forces of the Umayyad Caliph Yazid Thiassum. The massacre at Karbala transformed Shia Islam into a religion of suffering and resistance, a faith whose adherents understood themselves as a persecuted minority, struggling to preserve the true teaching of the Prophet against rulers who had stolen authority that did not belong to them. The commemoration of Hussein's martyrdom became the central ritual of Shia religious practice, marked annually during the month of Muharram, with mourning ceremonies that reminded the faithful of the injustice that had been done to the Prophet's family, and the obligation that fell upon subsequent generations to continue the struggle for righteous leadership. As the Shia community developed over the following centuries, it produced its own internal divisions regarding the line of succession from Ali through his descendants, divisions that would eventually give rise to the particular branch of Shia Islam from which the Hashashin emerged. The mainstream of Shia Islam, which would eventually become known as Twelver Shi'ism, recognized a line of 12 Imams descending from Ali through Hussein, a line that ended in the 9th century when the 12th Imam was believed to have entered a state of occultation or hidden existence from which he would one day return to establish justice on earth. However, a significant minority of Shia Muslims rejected the Twelver position and instead followed a different line of succession that had diverged in the 8th century, over the question of which son of the 6th Imam, Jafar al-Sadiq, should be recognized as his rightful heir. While the Twelvers followed the line through Musa al-Kazim, another group followed the line through his older brother Ismail, and this group became known as the Ismailis, a designation that would eventually encompass a range of movements and sects that shared a common commitment to the Ismaili line of succession, while differing considerably in their specific doctrines and organizational structures. The Ismaili movement that would eventually produce the Hashashin reached its greatest power during the 10th and 11th centuries, when a dynasty of Ismaili caliphs known as the Fatimids established a rival caliphate based in Egypt that challenged the authority of the Sunni Abbasid caliphs in Baghdad. The Fatimid Caliphate represented the first major Ismaili state in Islamic history, a political entity that controlled Egypt, much of North Africa, and significant portions of the Levant and Arabian Peninsula, providing Ismaili missionaries with resources and protection that allowed them to spread their teachings throughout the Islamic world. The Fatimid period also witnessed the development of sophisticated Ismaili theology, a system of esoteric interpretation that understood the Quran and Islamic law as containing hidden meanings accessible only to those who had received proper initiation into the hierarchy of spiritual knowledge that the Ismaili Imams preserved and transmitted. This esoteric dimension of Ismaili thought proved attractive to intellectuals who found the legalistic focus of mainstream Sunni Islam spiritually unsatisfying, and Ismaili missionaries successfully recruited converts throughout Persia, Iraq, Syria, and the Indian subcontinent, building networks of believers who maintained their faith in secret while outwardly conforming to the Sunni practices of the societies in which they lived. The crisis that would eventually give rise to the Hashashin emerged from a succession dispute within the Fatimid Caliphate itself, a dispute that divided the Ismaili community in the late 11th century and created the conditions under which a new, more radical form of Ismaili organisation could emerge. The dispute centred on the succession of the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir, who ruled Egypt from 1036 to 1094, a reign of 58 years that encompassed both the greatest territorial expansion of Fatimid power and the beginning of its decline. When al-Mustansir died, his designated successor, a young prince named Nizar, was passed over in favour of his younger brother al-Mustali, a decision made by the powerful vizier al-Afdal, who had effectively controlled the Fatimid government during the final years of al-Mustansir's reign. Nizar attempted to claim his inheritance through force, raising a rebellion in Alexandria that was crushed by al-Afdal's armies, and he subsequently died in prison under circumstances that remain unclear but almost certainly involved foul play at the vizier's direction. The death of Nizar created a schism within the Ismaili community between those who accepted al-Mustali and his descendants as the legitimate continuation of the imamate, and those who rejected this line as illegitimate and continued to recognise Nizar and his descendants as the true imams. The man who would transform this theological dispute into a revolutionary movement was Hassani Sabah, a Persian scholar born around 1050 in the city of Qom, one of the major centres of Shia learning in the Islamic world. The details of Hassan's early life are obscured by the passage of centuries and by the tendency of both his followers and his enemies to construct legendary accounts that served their respective purposes, but the broad outlines of his biography can be reconstructed from the surviving sources with reasonable confidence. Hassan grew up in an environment saturated with Shia religious learning, receiving an education in Islamic law, theology and philosophy that would later enable him to construct the sophisticated doctrinal framework that held his organisation together. At some point during his youth, Hassan encountered Ismaili missionaries and was converted to the Ismaili cause, a conversion that transformed him from a conventional Shia scholar into a committed revolutionary who believed that the Sunni establishment that controlled the Islamic world was fundamentally illegitimate, and that the true faith required protection through whatever means proved necessary. Following his conversion, Hassan travelled to Cairo, the capital of the Fatimid Caliphate, where he spent several years studying under the direction of the Fatimid religious establishment and deepening his understanding of Ismaili doctrine. The years Hassan spent in Cairo were formative ones that exposed him to the sophisticated intellectual culture of the Fatimid court, while also revealing to him the political intrigues and power struggles that characterized life at the centre of Ismaili power. Hassan would later claim that during his time in Cairo he had received personal instruction from the Imam al-Mustansir himself, a claim that gave his subsequent activities the legitimacy of direct authorization from the highest spiritual authority in the Ismaili world. Whether this claim was accurate or represented a later embellishment designed to strengthen Hassan's position, it established a direct connection between Hassan's mission and the authority of the Fatimid imamate that would prove crucial to his ability to recruit followers and maintain their loyalty in the difficult years ahead. Hassan returned to Persia sometime in the 1080s, carrying with him a commission to spread the Ismaili faith in the eastern regions of the Islamic world and to build networks of believers who could advance the cause of the true imams against the Sunni establishment. The Persia to which Hassan returned was controlled by the Seljuk Turks, a dynasty of Sunni rulers who had conquered much of the eastern Islamic world in the mid-11th century, and who maintained a hostile attitude towards Shia movements in general and Ismaili activities in particular. The Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah and his powerful vizier Nizam al-Mulk had built a centralized bureaucratic state that pursued a deliberate policy of Sunni orthodoxy, establishing madrasas or religious schools throughout their territories to train scholars in Sunni jurisprudence and to counter the influence of heterodox movements. Operating in this environment required Hassan to develop techniques of clandestine organization and careful security that would later become hallmarks of the Hashashin movement. For an Ismaili missionary who attracted the attention of Seljuk authorities could expect imprisonment or death as the consequence of his activities. For approximately a decade, Hassan travelled throughout Persia, building networks of converts and identifying potential bases from which a more organised movement could eventually operate. The missionary methods he employed combined religious instruction with political activism, offering his converts not merely a theological alternative to Sunni Islam, but a vision of social transformation in which the unjust rulers who currently dominated the Islamic world would be replaced by the righteous leadership of the true imams. This combination of religious idealism and political radicalism proved attractive to Persians who resented Seljuk Turkish rule, who felt marginalised by the Sunni establishment that dominated urban religious life, or who simply found the esoteric mysteries of Ismaili doctrine more spiritually satisfying than the legalistic focus of mainstream Islam. Hassan's converts came from diverse social backgrounds, including craftsmen, merchants, soldiers, and even members of the local nobility, creating a cross-section of Persian society united by their commitment to the Ismaili cause and their loyalty to the charismatic missionary who had brought them into the fold. The decisive moment in the transformation of Hassan's missionary network into a territorial power came on September 4th, 1090, when Hassan-i Sabah seized control of the fortress of Alamut through a combination of infiltration, conversion, and strategic patience that would become characteristic of his operational methods. Alamut was a mountain fortress located in the Alborz range of northern Persia, in a region called Daylem that had historically served as a refuge for Shia communities fleeing persecution in the lowland cities. The fortress had been built centuries earlier by a local king and had passed through various hands before coming under the control of a Seljuk-appointed governor whose garrison maintained the Sultan's authority in this remote and strategically significant region. Hassan had spent years preparing for the seizure of Alamut, sending missionaries into the surrounding villages to convert the local population, placing his followers within the garrison itself through patient infiltration, and building a network of supporters who could act in coordination when the moment for action arrived. When Hassan finally entered the fortress, the garrison's loyalty had been so thoroughly undermined that only a handful of soldiers remained faithful to the Seljuk governor, and these were persuaded to accept payment for their departure, rather than resist a takeover that they could not prevent. The acquisition of Alamut gave Hassan-i Sabah something that no previous Ismaili leader in Persia had possessed: a territorial base that was essentially impregnable to conventional military assault, and from which a sustained campaign of religious and political resistance could be conducted. The fortress's natural defences were remarkable even by the standards of medieval mountain fortifications, for it sat atop a narrow ridge accessible only through a single winding path that could be defended by a small number of determined men against armies many times their size. The surrounding mountains provided additional defensive depth, creating a landscape of narrow valleys and high passes that would channel any invading force into killing grounds where superior numbers counted for little. Hassan immediately set about improving these natural advantages, expanding the fortress's walls, constructing additional defensive works, and establishing systems of supply and communication that would allow Alamut to withstand extended sieges. He also began the process of replicating his success at other mountain fortresses throughout the region, building a network of strongholds that would eventually extend from the Alborz mountains of Persia to the coastal ranges of Syria, creating a distributed state that could not be destroyed through the capture of any single fortress. The Seljuk response to the loss of Alamut was immediate and violent, for the Sultan and his advisors recognized the threat that Hassan's fortress posed to their control of northern Persia, and to the stability of their empire more generally. In 1092, the Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk personally directed a campaign to recapture Alamut and destroy the Ismaili movement before it could consolidate its position, sending armies into the mountains and attempting to starve out the fortress through prolonged siege. These efforts proved futile, for the terrain favoured the defenders, the local population supported the Ismailis, and Hassan's preparations had ensured that Alamut possessed sufficient supplies to outlast any siege that Seljuk forces could maintain in such a difficult country. The failure of conventional military approaches to dislodge the Ismailis from their mountain strongholds led Nizam al-Mulk to intensify his persecution of Ismaili communities throughout the Seljuk realm, executing suspected sympathisers, imprisoning missionaries, and attempting to cut off the flow of recruits and resources that sustained Hassan's movement. It was in response to this escalating persecution that Hassan-i Sabah developed the tactical innovation that would make his organisation famous throughout the medieval world: the systematic use of targeted assassination as a tool of political warfare. The first major assassination carried out by Hassan's followers occurred on October 14th, 1092, when a young Ismaili disguised as a Sufi mystic approached the vizier Nizam al-Mulk as he was being carried in his litter and stabbed him to death before being killed himself by the vizier's guards. The murder of Nizam al-Mulk was not merely an act of revenge for his persecution of the Ismaili community, but a calculated strategic strike designed to disrupt the Seljuk war effort and demonstrate that even the most powerful men in the Islamic world were not beyond the reach of Ismaili justice. The assassination achieved both objectives with stunning effectiveness, for Nizam al-Mulk had been the architect of Seljuk policy and the coordinator of the anti-Ismaili campaign, and his death threw the imperial government into confusion at precisely the moment when sustained pressure might have crushed the nascent movement. Within weeks of the vizier's death, Sultan Malik Shah himself died under suspicious circumstances, and the Seljuk Empire descended into a civil war among the Sultan's sons that would last for decades and provide the Ismailis with the breathing room they needed to consolidate their position. The success of the assassination of Nizam al-Mulk established a template that Hassan and his successors would follow throughout the history of the Hashashin order. When faced with enemies too powerful to defeat through conventional military means, identify the individuals whose death would most disrupt the enemy's capacity for coordinated action, train operatives capable of reaching those individuals, and send those operatives to their deaths with the assurance that their sacrifice served the highest purposes of divine justice. The assassinations that followed over the next century and a half would include viziers, generals, religious scholars who preached against the Ismailis, local governors who persecuted Ismaili communities, and crusader leaders who threatened Ismaili territories in Syria. The targets were carefully selected based on their importance to enemy operations and their vulnerability to infiltration, and the operatives who carried out the killings were prepared through years of training that combined religious instruction, physical conditioning, and the cultivation of the unwavering commitment to the cause that would allow them to walk calmly towards certain death. The Hashashin rarely attempted to escape after completing their missions, a practice that served both practical and symbolic purposes, for it eliminated the risk that captured assassins might reveal information about the organization under torture, while also demonstrating to the world that Ismaili devotees possessed a willingness to die that placed them beyond the reach of ordinary intimidation. The organizational structure that Hassani Sabah developed to sustain this campaign of targeted killing was as innovative as the tactical concept itself, for it created a system capable of recruiting, training, and deploying operatives across vast distances while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect the organization from infiltration and destruction. At the apex of this structure stood the Grand Master, a title that Hassan held until his death in 1124, possessing absolute authority over all aspects of the organization's operations and serving as the spiritual leader whose commands carried the force of divine instruction. Below the Grand Master stood a hierarchy of regional commanders, missionaries and initiates organized into concentric circles of trust in which higher levels possessed knowledge and authority denied to those below them. The outer circles of this hierarchy included ordinary believers who supported the Ismaili cause through financial contributions, hospitality to missionaries, and willingness to conceal the organization's activities from hostile authorities, while the inner circles comprised the dedicated operatives known as fidayyin, or self-sacrificers, who had committed themselves to martyrdom in service of the Imam's commands. The training of the fidayyin represented the most distinctive feature of the Hashashin organization, for it produced operatives capable of penetrating the most heavily guarded courts in the Islamic world and striking with a precision that seemed to contemporary observers to verge on the supernatural. Young men identified as potential fidayyin were brought to Alamut or one of the other Ismaili fortresses and subjected to a regimen of instruction that could last for years, encompassing not only the physical skills of combat and stealth, but also the linguistic abilities, cultural knowledge, and social graces necessary to adopt convincing cover identities in environments far from their original homes. Fidayyin learned multiple languages, studied the customs and etiquette of various courts, and developed the capacity to pass as members of different social classes and religious communities, enabling them to infiltrate positions as servants, guards, clerks, or even trusted advisors to the very men they had been sent to kill. The religious education that accompanied this practical training reinforced the Fidayyin's conviction that their mission served divine purposes that transcended the individual calculations of earthly existence, making them willing instruments of a justice that ordinary human institutions were incapable of delivering. The 35 years during which Hassan-i-Sabbah ruled from Alamut witnessed the transformation of what had begun as a persecuted missionary network into a territorial power capable of defending itself against the greatest empires of the Islamic world. From the single fortress seized in 1090, the Ashashin expanded to control dozens of strongholds scattered throughout the mountains of Persia, and, through affiliated movements, the coastal ranges of Syria. The Syrian branch of the order, which operated semi-independently under its own chain of Grand Masters, established a network of castles that would bring the Hashashin into direct contact with the crusader states and produce some of the most dramatic episodes in the history of medieval assassination. The Persian branch, which Hassan ruled directly, focused primarily on defence against Seljuk aggression, while continuing to conduct assassination operations against those who threatened the community. Throughout this period, Hassan himself remained within the walls of Alamut, reportedly never leaving the fortress after he first entered it in 1090, and spending his final decades in study, writing, and the direction of the organisation he had created. According to later accounts, he occupied a single chamber within the fortress, living with extreme austerity while exercising absolute control over a movement whose influence extended across continents. The death of Hassan-i-Sabbah in 1124 marked the end of the founding phase of Hashashin history, but the organisation he had created would continue to operate for more than a century afterward, surviving transitions of leadership, weathering military campaigns that would have destroyed less resilient structures, and maintaining its capacity for targeted killing that kept enemies at bay and protected the Ismaili communities scattered throughout the Islamic world. The successors who followed Hassan as Grand Masters of Alamut built upon his foundations while adapting the organisation to changing circumstances, negotiating with crusaders and Seljuks alike, expanding the network of fortresses that secured Ismaili autonomy, and preserving the distinctive religious culture that gave meaning to the sacrifices the organisation demanded of its members. The Hashashin flourished during the chaotic decades of the 12th century, when the Islamic world was divided among competing powers, and no single authority possessed the strength to mount a sustained campaign of extermination against the mountain fortresses. They survived the rise of Saladin and the reunification of Islamic opposition to the Crusaders, maintaining their independence through a combination of strategic assassination and diplomatic manoeuvring that left even the great Sultan uncertain whether confrontation or accommodation offered the wiser path. They endured the arrival of new Mongol reconnaissance forces in the early 13th century, probing expeditions that hinted at the catastrophe to come, but that did not yet possess the strength to assault the fortress network directly. The world into which the Order of Assassins had emerged in 1090 was one in which the Islamic political order, despite its internal divisions, maintained a fundamental stability that allowed religious minorities to survive through accommodation, concealment, or flight to marginal territories beyond the effective reach of central authority. The mountains of Persia had provided refuge for Shia communities for centuries before Hassan-i-Sabbah arrived, and the strategy of seizing defensible fortresses and building autonomous enclaves was in many respects a continuation of patterns that had shaped Shia survival throughout the Abbasid period. What Hassan added to these traditional strategies was the systematic use of targeted violence as a tool of deterrence and political influence, transforming the Ismaili community from a persecuted minority seeking merely to survive into an active power, capable of projecting force across vast distances and shaping the calculations of rulers who commanded armies many times larger than anything the Ismailis could field. The success of this strategy depended upon the continued fragmentation of the Islamic political order, upon the existence of multiple competing powers whose rivalries prevented any single authority from concentrating sufficient force against the mountain fortresses for long enough to reduce them. When the Mongols arrived in force in the 1250s, they brought with them precisely the overwhelming concentration of power that the Ismaili defensive system could not withstand, and the fortresses that had defied every previous assault fell one after another before armies that possessed both the numerical strength to sustain prolonged sieges and the organisational capacity to maintain coordination across multiple theatres of operation. But in the autumn of 1256, as Hulagu Khan's forces descended upon Alamut, 166 years of history lay between that moment and the night when Hassan-i-Sabbah had first entered the fortress through guile rather than force. The library that the Mongols would burn contained manuscripts accumulated across those generations, theological treatises and historical chronicles that preserved the memory of the order's origins and the doctrines that had sustained it through decades of warfare and persecution. The men who defended the walls had inherited traditions of training and sacrifice that stretched back through the chain of Grand Masters to the founder himself, and they understood that they were defending not merely a collection of stone buildings, but the physical embodiment of a religious vision that had shaped the lives of their ancestors, and that would, they believed, continue to shape the lives of their descendants, regardless of what earthly powers might accomplish through violence. The story of how that vision emerged, how it was institutionalized in the fortress complex centered on Alamut, and how it produced the campaign of assassination that would make the Hashashin name immortal, requires understanding not merely the political circumstances of late 11th century Persia, but the religious ideas that transformed a persecuted sect into an organization that could convince young men to walk calmly towards certain death in service of a justice they believed transcended anything that earthly existence could provide. The theological foundations upon which Hassan-i-Sabbah constructed his revolutionary organization drew from centuries of Ismaili intellectual tradition, a tradition that had developed in the shadows of persecution and flourished in the brief intervals when Ismaili rulers had commanded significant political power. The Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, established in 909, and claiming descent from the Prophet Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and son-in-law Ali, had provided the Ismaili movement with its first opportunity to develop a comprehensive theological and philosophical system under state patronage, producing generations of scholars who elaborated doctrines that would later be transmitted to the mountain fortresses of Persia and Syria. The Ismaili cosmology that Hassan inherited from this tradition posited a universe governed by hierarchical principles of knowledge and authority, in which spiritual truth descended through chains of divinely appointed teachers whose guidance was essential for human salvation. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the Imam, the divinely guided descendant of Ali who possessed the inner knowledge necessary to interpret the esoteric meanings concealed within the external forms of religious law. The Imam's authority was absolute in matters both spiritual and temporal, and obedience to the Imam was not merely a political obligation, but a religious duty upon which the believer's eternal fate depended. This emphasis on hierarchical authority and absolute obedience provided the theological foundation for the disciplined structure that would characterize the Order of Assassins, creating an organizational culture in which commands from the Grand Master carried the weight of divine instruction, and in which sacrifice in service of the community was understood as the highest form of religious devotion. The doctrine of taqiyya, or religiously permitted concealment of one's true beliefs in circumstances of danger, had developed among Shia communities over centuries of persecution by Sunni majorities, and this doctrine provided essential justification for the practices of infiltration and deception that would characterize the assassin's methods. A believer who concealed his Ismaili faith while serving in the household of a Sunni ruler was not committing apostasy, but rather practicing a form of religious duty sanctioned by the accumulated wisdom of Ismaili legal and theological tradition. This doctrine allowed the organization to plant agents in positions of trust throughout the Islamic world, men who might live for years or decades among their enemies while awaiting the command that would reveal their true loyalty and purpose. The concept of the fidai, the devoted one who sacrificed himself in service of the imam and the community, represented the culmination of these theological principles in a form of religiously sanctioned martyrdom that distinguished the Ismaili practice of assassination from the ordinary political violence that characterized medieval statecraft. The fidai did not kill for personal gain or advancement, nor did he act from the base motives of revenge or ambition that drove ordinary murderers. He acted as an instrument of divine justice, executing the sentences pronounced by the imam's representative against those who had oppressed the true believers or threatened the survival of the community. His death was not a regrettable consequence of a dangerous mission, but rather the consummation of his devotion, a passage from the imperfect realm of earthly existence to the eternal rewards that awaited those who had given everything in service of the truth. The training that produced these devoted operatives combined physical preparation with intensive religious instruction, ensuring that the fidai who departed on his final mission understood not merely the practical requirements of his task, but the cosmic significance of his sacrifice. Hassan-i-Sabbah's contribution to this theological inheritance lay not in the development of fundamentally new doctrines, but in the application of existing principles to the specific circumstances of the Ismaili community in Persia under Seljuk persecution. The Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, which claimed the allegiance of Ismailis throughout the Islamic world as the seat of the true Imam, had by the late 11th century entered a period of internal crisis and declining power that limited its ability to provide effective support to distant communities facing persecution. The schism that would eventually divide the Ismaili movement into separate Nizari and Mustali branches had its origins in a succession dispute following the death of the Fatimid Caliph al-Mustansir in 1094, 4 years after Hassan had established himself at Alamut. Hassan supported the claims of Nizar, the elder son of al-Mustansir, who was passed over in favour of his younger brother al-Mustali, in a succession orchestrated by the powerful Vizier al-Afdal. When Nizar's attempt to claim his inheritance ended in failure and death, Hassan and his followers maintained that the true imamate had passed through Nizar's line, a position that placed the Persian Ismailis in opposition to the Fatimid establishment in Cairo, and that required the development of independent theological and institutional structures no longer dependent upon Egyptian patronage. This break with Cairo transformed the Ismaili communities of Persia and Syria from provincial outposts of a larger movement into an autonomous organization that required its own mechanisms for transmitting authority, training leadership, and maintaining doctrinal coherence across widely scattered fortress communities. Hassani Sabah became not merely the local representative of a distant imam, but the practical head of an independent religious state, exercising authority in the imam's name and developing the institutional structures that would allow the community to survive and flourish in the absence of direct imamic guidance. The doctrine of the hujjah, or proof, provided theological justification for this arrangement, designating the Grand Master as the representative who spoke with the imam's authority during the period of concealment when the imam himself could not be present to guide his community directly. This doctrine allowed the organization to function with absolute internal discipline while maintaining the fiction of ultimate subordination to an imam whose physical location and identity remained matters of theological speculation and doctrinal controversy. The fortress of Alamut itself became the physical embodiment of these theological principles, a sacred space where the community's most precious possessions were preserved and where the rituals that sustained collective identity and purpose were performed according to traditions established by the founder and elaborated by his successors. The library that Hassan assembled at Alamut contained not merely practical works on military strategy and fortress defence, but the theological and philosophical texts that formed the intellectual foundation of the movement, including works by earlier Ismaili scholars, collections of sermons and letters from the founder himself, and chronicles recording the history of the community from its origins through the present day. The gardens that were cultivated within the fortress walls, renowned throughout the region for their beauty and abundance, served symbolic as well as practical purposes, providing physical manifestation of the paradise that awaited the faithful, while demonstrating the order's capacity to create flourishing life even in the harsh mountain environment. Visitors who were permitted to enter Alamut reported experiencing sensations of wonder and otherworldliness, as if they had passed from the ordinary world into a realm governed by different principles, and these reports contributed to the legends that would eventually surround the order with an aura of supernatural power and occult knowledge. The training program that produced the Fidai operatives combined these theological elements with intensive practical instruction in the skills required for their missions. Young men selected for this training typically entered the system in their adolescence, chosen from among the most devoted and capable members of the community based on assessments of their physical abilities, psychological stability, and depth of religious commitment. The initial phase of their training emphasized physical conditioning and combat skills, including proficiency with the dagger that would become the iconic weapon of the assassins, techniques of hand-to-hand combat that could be employed when surprise was no longer possible, and methods of escape and evasion for the rare circumstances when a mission might allow for survival. Language instruction formed a critical component of this preparation, as operatives needed to function convincingly in Arabic, Persian, and often Turkish environments, depending on the nature of their assignments, and the ability to adopt the speech patterns and cultural behaviours of different social classes and ethnic groups could determine the success or failure of infiltration efforts that might extend over years. The theological component of training was equally intensive, grounding the prospective Fidai in the doctrines that gave meaning to his anticipated sacrifice and preparing him psychologically for the certainty of death that awaited at the conclusion of his mission. Extended periods of meditation and spiritual discipline were designed to detach the trainee from the ordinary attachments of earthly existence, freeing him from the fear of death and the natural human instincts of self-preservation that might cause hesitation at the critical moment. The communities within the fortress compounds provided constant reinforcement of these teachings, as trainees lived among others who shared their devotion and who venerated those who had departed on missions from which they would not return. Memorial practices preserved the names and stories of successful fidei, presenting them as exemplars of the highest form of religious devotion and assuring trainees that their own names would be similarly honoured in the collective memory of the community. The psychological conditioning that produced men capable of walking calmly towards certain death has attracted considerable speculation from later observers, much of it influenced by the legends that would develop around the order in subsequent centuries. The term hashashin itself, from which the English word assassin derives, reflects theories that the operatives were drugged with hashish, either to induce visions of paradise that motivated their devotion, or to produce the calm detachment that characterized their behavior during missions. Contemporary sources provide limited evidence for systematic drug use in the training program, and the theological and social conditioning described above offers sufficient explanation for the psychological states that observers found so remarkable. The trainees were not deceived drug addicts manipulated by cynical leaders, but sincere believers who understood their sacrifice as the culmination of their religious duty, and who anticipated the rewards of martyrdom with the same certainty that characterized believers throughout the history of religious movements that produce similar phenomena of voluntary self-sacrifice. The organizational structure that supported this training program and directed the activities of the fidei reflected the same principles of hierarchical authority that characterized Ismaili theology. Below the Grand Master, who exercised supreme authority from his position at Alamut, a hierarchy of regional commanders, fortress governors, and local leaders transmitted orders and collected intelligence according to established protocols that maintained operational security while ensuring coordination across the scattered fortress network. The rank of Dai, or missionary, designated those responsible for the religious instruction and recruitment activities that maintained the community's strength across generations, while specialized ranks indicated particular functions within the military and administrative apparatus. This hierarchical structure was maintained with strict discipline, and the punishments for disobedience or betrayal were severe enough to ensure that security breaches remained extremely rare throughout the Order's history. The fortress network that provided the physical foundation for this organizational structure expanded significantly during the decades following the capture of Alamut, as Hassan Isaba and his successors acquired additional strongholds through the same combination of conversion, purchase, and seizure that had proved successful in the initial campaign. The mountains of northern Persia provided numerous sites suitable for the construction of defensible positions, and the communities that the Ismailis established in valleys surrounding these fortresses created the agricultural base necessary to sustain the military and religious apparatus. The fortress of Lamasar, situated in the Rudbar region approximately 30 kilometers from Alamut, served as a secondary centre of the Order's operations in Persia, its defences complementing those of the primary headquarters and providing strategic depth that complicated any enemy attempt to eliminate the movement through military action. The fortress of Girdku in the Kumis region extended the Order's presence eastward toward Khorasan, while additional strongholds in the Kohistan region of southeastern Persia created a third major concentration of Ismaili power that could operate with considerable autonomy while remaining connected to the central leadership through the chain of command that radiated outward from Alamut. The acquisition of fortresses in Syria during the early 12th century extended the Order's reach into a region where political fragmentation and the presence of crusader states created opportunities for expansion and influence that differed significantly from the Persian context. The Syrian branch of the Order developed under its own leadership, eventually achieving considerable autonomy under a succession of commanders who adapted the methods and doctrines developed at Alamut to the specific circumstances of a region where Latin Christians, Byzantine Greeks, and multiple competing Muslim powers created a complex political environment that rewarded flexibility and local knowledge. The fortress of Masyaf, acquired by the Ismailis in 1141, became the primary seat of the Syrian branch and the residence of the commanders whose activities would bring the Order into direct confrontation with the Crusader states and whose legendary reputation would contribute significantly to the image of the assassins that would eventually reach European audiences. The mountains of the Jabal Ansariya, running parallel to the Syrian coast between the coastal cities held by the Crusaders and the interior territories controlled by various Muslim powers, provided the same advantages of defensibility and isolation that the Elburz Mountains had offered in Persia, and the population of these highlands included communities with traditions of heterodox religious belief that proved receptive to Ismaili missionary activity. The relationship between the Persian and Syrian branches of the order involved both cooperation and tension, as the Syrian commanders maintained loyalty to the Grand Master at Alamut in matters of doctrine and overall strategy, while exercising considerable independence in the conduct of local operations. Communications between Alamut and the Syrian fortresses required the maintenance of courier networks across territories controlled by hostile powers, and the distances involved meant that Syrian commanders frequently needed to make decisions without the possibility of consultation with the central leadership. This practical autonomy was formalized over time, with the Syrian branch developing its own traditions of leadership succession and its own relationships with the political powers of the region, while remaining connected to Alamut through the theological and organizational frameworks that defined Ismaili identity. The Grand Masters at Alamut continued to exercise ultimate authority over the movement as a whole, and major doctrinal pronouncements issued from the Persian headquarters were received and implemented by the Syrian branch, but the day-to-day operations of the two regions proceeded according to their own internal dynamics and responded to their own local circumstances. The campaign of assassination that made the order famous began immediately upon Hassani Saba's establishment at Alamut, and continued throughout the subsequent century and a half of the organization's existence, targeting Seljuk officials, military commanders, religious scholars who preached against the Ismailis, and eventually figures from across the spectrum of Islamic and Crusader political leadership. The first recorded assassination attributed to the order occurred in October 1092, less than 2 years after the capture of Alamut, when an operative disguised as a Sufi mystic approached the Great Vizier Nizam al-Mulk during a journey through Persia and stabbed him to death. The symbolic significance of this initial success cannot be overstated, as Nizam al-Mulk had been not merely the most powerful administrator in the Seljuk Empire, but also the architect of the policies of religious persecution that had targeted Ismaili communities throughout the realm. His assassination demonstrated that no figure, however powerful or well protected, was beyond the reach of the order's operatives, and the psychological impact of this demonstration reverberated throughout the Islamic world, changing the calculations of every ruler and official who contemplated policies hostile to the Ismaili community. The Sultan Malik Shah died only weeks after his vizier, possibly by natural causes but under circumstances that invited speculation about Ismaili involvement, and the Seljuk Empire immediately fragmented into competing factions whose internal conflicts prevented the prosecution of sustained military campaigns against the mountain fortresses. This pattern of strategic assassination followed by political fragmentation would characterize the order's operations throughout its history, as the removal of key figures repeatedly disrupted the consolidation of power that might have permitted effective action against the Ismaili strongholds. The timing and target selection for these operations revealed sophisticated intelligence capabilities and strategic analysis, as the order consistently identified and eliminated individuals whose removal would produce maximum political disruption while avoiding provocations that might unite otherwise divided enemies in common cause against the common threat. The methodology of assassination developed and refined over the decades following the initial operation against Nizam al-Mulk reflected the unique requirements of attacking targets who possessed extensive security arrangements and who lived within environments designed to prevent exactly the kind of attack the assassins intended. The preference for the dagger as the primary weapon was not merely symbolic, but practical, as a concealed blade could be carried through security inspections that would detect larger weapons, and the close-range nature of dagger attacks ensured positive identification of the target at the moment of the strike. The operatives typically made no attempt to escape following successful assassinations, accepting their immediate death at the hands of guards or the crowd that gathered around them as the natural and expected conclusion of their mission. This willingness to die served multiple purposes beyond the theological meanings discussed above, as it eliminated the possibility of interrogation that might compromise the organization's security and created a psychological impact on observers that far exceeded what an assassination followed by escape would have produced. The public nature of many assassinations was deliberately calculated to maximize the deterrent effect and to demonstrate the order's capabilities to the widest possible audience. An operative who struck down a prominent figure in a crowded mosque during Friday prayers in the presence of hundreds of witnesses sent a message that no setting was safe and that the Ismaili reach extended even into the most sacred spaces of Islamic religious life. The calm demeanour that operatives typically displayed during and after successful attacks, making no attempt to flee and meeting their own deaths with apparent indifference, contributed to the aura of supernatural dedication that surrounded the order in contemporary accounts. Observers struggled to comprehend how ordinary men could exhibit such complete disregard for their own survival, and the explanations they developed, including theories about drug-induced states and elaborate deceptions involving artificial paradises, reflected the difficulty of understanding the psychological conditioning that the order had perfected over decades of refinement. The physical techniques employed by the Fidei evolved over time in response to the defensive measures that potential targets adopted following the establishment of the order's reputation. Security arrangements around important figures became increasingly elaborate, with multiple layers of guards, careful inspection of those permitted to approach, and restrictions on the public appearances that created opportunities for attack. The assassins responded to these measures by developing methods of long-term infiltration that allowed operatives to establish positions within the household or security apparatus of their targets, building trust over months or years before receiving the order to strike. These infiltrators might serve as loyal and valuable members of a ruler's entourage for extended periods, their true allegiance known only to themselves and to the handlers who maintained contact through the covert communication networks that connected agents in the field with the leadership at Alamut or the Syrian fortresses. The sophistication of these infiltration operations required organizational capabilities that extended far beyond the individual courage and dedication of the operatives themselves, encompassing networks of recruitment, communication, and support that operated across vast geographic distances and maintained their integrity despite the hostile environment in which they functioned. The Order developed systems for identifying potential recruits who possessed the particular combination of intelligence, physical capability, and psychological resilience that successful long-term infiltration demanded, and these recruitment efforts extended into communities and populations that would not have been obvious sources of Ismaili operatives. Young men who demonstrated the requisite qualities might be cultivated over years before their formal induction into the Order, their loyalties carefully assessed and their suitability for different types of operations evaluated through graduated tests that revealed their capabilities without exposing the organization to unacceptable risk. The training regimens that transformed these recruits into operational Fidei combined physical conditioning, weapons proficiency, and psychological preparation with instruction in the various skills that infiltration operations required, including the ability to adopt and maintain false identities, to function within cultural environments different from their own, and to sustain apparent loyalty to targets while preserving their true allegiance to the Order and its mission. The linguistic capabilities developed by operatives reflected the multilingual environment in which the Order operated, and the diverse cultural settings into which agents might be inserted. An infiltrator, assigned to the court of a Seljuk official, required fluency not only in Persian, but in the particular dialect and register appropriate to the role being assumed, while operations in Crusader territories demanded knowledge of Frankish languages and customs that would allow an operative to function convincingly within Latin Christian environments. The Order maintained instructors capable of providing this linguistic training, and the curriculum developed for operatives destined for particular assignments incorporated detailed knowledge of the cultural practices, religious observances, and social hierarchies that characterized their target environments. An operative who could not convincingly perform the prayers and observe the customs expected of someone in his assumed position would immediately attract the suspicion that meant mission failure and death, making cultural competence as essential as physical skills and psychological conditioning to the success of infiltration operations. The communication networks that connected agents in the field with the organizational leadership represented one of the most remarkable achievements of the Order's operational infrastructure, maintaining secure channels of information transmission across distances that might span hundreds of miles of territory controlled by hostile powers. Messages travelled through chains of couriers whose compartmentalized knowledge protected the overall network from compromise even when individual links were discovered and destroyed, with each courier knowing only the identities of the contacts immediately adjacent to his position in the chain and remaining ignorant of the larger structure within which he functioned. The content of these messages was protected by systems of cipher and code that rendered intercepted communications unintelligible to those who captured them, while the timing and routing of message transmission followed patterns designed to minimize the risk of interception and to provide alternative channels when primary routes became compromised. The information that flowed through these networks encompassed not only operational orders and reports, but also the intelligence that informed strategic decision-making at Alamut, as agents throughout the region transmitted observations about political developments, military movements, and potential targets that the leadership synthesized into comprehensive assessments of the strategic environment. The intelligence-gathering function of the Order's networks produced an information advantage that compensated for the organization's limited military resources and small population base, allowing the leadership to identify opportunities and vulnerabilities that would have remained invisible to powers relying on conventional sources of information. Merchants who conducted business across the region, travelers who moved between cities and courts, servants who worked within the households of prominent figures, and religious scholars who corresponded with colleagues throughout the Islamic world all contributed information to networks that aggregated and analysed these disparate reports into coherent pictures of political and military developments. The systematic collection and evaluation of intelligence represented an organisational capability that few contemporary powers possessed at comparable levels of sophistication, and this information advantage allowed the Order to act with a precision and timing that enhanced the impact of its limited operational resources far beyond what raw numbers would suggest. A single assassination, executed at precisely the moment when the target's death would produce maximum political disruption, could achieve strategic effects that armies numbering in the thousands could not match. But identifying that moment required intelligence capabilities that took decades to develop and constant effort to maintain. The financial structures that supported the Order's operations demonstrated similar sophistication, as the maintenance of fortress networks, training programs, intelligence operations, and diplomatic activities required resources that the mountain territories alone could not provide. The Order developed multiple revenue streams that included agricultural production from the irrigated land surrounding its fortresses, tribute payments from communities that purchased protection from Ismaili operations, commercial activities conducted by merchants who were either members of the organization or who operated under its protection, and subsidies from external powers who found the Order's capabilities useful against their own enemies. The management of these diverse revenue sources required administrative capabilities that belied the image of the Order as merely a collection of fortresses and fanatics, encompassing accounting systems, collection networks, and distribution mechanisms that ensured resources reached the various components of the organization that required them. The financial records maintained at Alamut, which were destroyed during the Mongol conquest and are known only through fragmentary references in surviving sources, apparently documented these economic activities with considerable precision, tracking income and expenditure across the organization's territories and operations. The diplomatic activities of the Order during the decades following its establishment at Alamut reflected the leadership's recognition that survival in the hostile environment of the medieval Middle East required political relationships that supplemented military capabilities and provided alternatives to constant warfare. Despite the ideological framework that positioned the Ismailis as adversaries of Sunni political authority, practical considerations drove the development of working relationships with various Sunni powers whose interests temporarily aligned with those of the Order, or who found the Ismaili capabilities useful against their own enemies. The Seljuk sultans themselves, the nominal heads of the political structure that the Order theoretically opposed, occasionally found common cause with the Ismailis against rivals and rebels who threatened their positions, and these tactical alliances produced periods of reduced hostility during which the Order could consolidate its territorial holdings and develop its organizational infrastructure without facing sustained military pressure. The ability to shift between confrontation and accommodation, to maintain multiple diplomatic relationships simultaneously, and to exploit the divisions among potential enemies, demonstrated a strategic flexibility that contrasted with the rigid ideological posture that the Order projected to the outside world. The expansion of the Order's territorial holdings beyond the initial fortress at Alamut proceeded through a combination of methods that included direct military conquest, negotiated acquisition, an internal subversion of communities whose populations could be converted or whose rulers could be pressured into accepting Ismaili authority. The mountain region south of the Caspian Sea provided numerous potential fortress sites whose natural defences could be enhanced through construction, and the order systematically acquired control of strategic positions that extended its defensive depth and provided multiple strongholds whose mutual support made the conquest of any single fortress insufficient to destroy the organisation. The castle of La Massar, acquired in 1096 just a few years after the seizure of Alamut, provided a secondary centre whose capabilities complemented those of the primary fortress, while subsequent acquisitions created a network of strongholds that eventually numbered more than 50 positions scattered across the mountain territories of northern Persia. Each of these fortresses required garrison forces, administrative personnel and supply arrangements that the organisational infrastructure of the order had to provide, and the management of this distributed network of territorial holdings represented an administrative challenge that grew more complex as the order's domain expanded. The garrison forces stationed at these various fortresses included both the elite fidei, whose training prepared them for assassination operations, and regular military personnel, whose function was the conventional defence of the positions they occupied. The defensive capabilities of the fortress network derived primarily from the natural advantages of the terrain, rather than from the numerical strength of these garrison forces, as the steep approaches and limited access routes that characterised mountain fortress sites allowed small numbers of defenders to hold positions against much larger attacking forces. The construction programs undertaken at Alamut and the other major fortresses enhanced these natural advantages through the building of walls, towers, gates and other defensive works that multiplied the effectiveness of the garrison troops, while the storage facilities that held supplies sufficient for extended sieges ensured that attackers could not simply surround a fortress and wait for starvation to compel surrender. The cost of constructing and maintaining these defensive works represented a major demand on the order's financial resources, but the security they provided justified the investment by ensuring that the organisation's core territories remained invulnerable to the military campaigns that Seljuk and other hostile forces periodically launched against them. The administrative structure that governed the order's territories evolved over time in response to the expanding scope of operations and the increasing complexity of organisational requirements. The position of the supreme leader, who held the title of Grand Master in the terminology that European sources would later employ, concentrated ultimate authority over both religious and secular matters, with the incumbent serving as the representative of the hidden imam, whose guidance theoretically directed all Ismaili affairs. Below this supreme leadership, a hierarchy of officials exercised delegated authority over various aspects of the order's operations, with geographic commanders responsible for particular fortress clusters or regional operations, functional specialists overseeing intelligence, training, finance, and other organisational necessities, and religious authorities maintaining the doctrinal purity and spiritual development that provided the ideological foundation for the order's activities. The relationships between these various officials and the mechanisms through which authority was delegated, exercised and supervised are imperfectly understood due to the destruction of the order's administrative records, but the organisational effectiveness that the order demonstrated across more than a century of operations implies sophisticated administrative systems that coordinated the activities of thousands of individuals spread across multiple geographic regions. The death of Hassan-i-Sabah in 1124 marked the end of the founding generation, and tested the organisational structures that he had created during more than 3 decades of leadership from Alamut. The succession proceeded without the disruptions that often accompanied leadership transitions in medieval political organisations, with Hassan having designated his successor and prepared the administrative apparatus to continue functioning under new direction. Buzurgmid, who assumed leadership following Hassan's death, maintained the policies and organisational structures that his predecessor had established while adapting them to the changing circumstances that the order faced in the decades following its foundation. The smooth transition of authority demonstrated that the organisation had developed institutional characteristics that transcended the personal capabilities of its founder, with systems and procedures that could function effectively regardless of which individual occupied the supreme leadership position. This institutional resilience would be tested repeatedly over the following century as successive leaders died or were replaced, and the order's continued effectiveness, despite these transitions, testified to the durability of the organisational foundations that Hassan-i-Sabah had laid during the formative period at Alamut. The second generation of Ismaili leadership confronted strategic circumstances that differed in important respects from those that had prevailed during the order's establishment, as the initial period of Seljuk weakness and fragmentation gave way to renewed consolidation under Sultan Sanjar, whose reign from 1118 to 1157 represented the last significant period of Seljuk unity and power. Sanjar's military capabilities posed a more serious threat to the Ismaili territories than the divided and contested authority of his predecessors, and the campaigns he launched against the mountain fortresses achieved greater success than earlier Seljuk efforts had managed. The order's response to this increased pressure combined defensive measures that exploited the natural advantages of the fortress network, with diplomatic initiatives that sought to establish working relationships that would reduce the intensity of Seljuk hostility, while assassination operations continued against officials and commanders whose elimination would disrupt the coordination of anti-Ismaili military efforts. The strategic flexibility that characterized the order's approach to external relations during this period reflected the leadership's recognition that survival required adaptation to changing circumstances rather than rigid adherence to policies developed under different conditions. The extension of Ismaili operations into Syria during this same period represented a major expansion of the order's geographic scope and created organizational challenges that the leadership at Alamut had to address, while simultaneously managing the increased pressure from Sanjar's campaigns in the Persian territories. The Syrian extension emerged from the broader Ismaili missionary activities that had long operated throughout the Islamic world, but the establishment of territorial holdings and military capabilities in Syria transformed what had been primarily a religious movement into an operational presence comparable to what the order had achieved in Persia. The geographic separation between the Persian and Syrian territories, with hundreds of miles of hostile territory intervening, created communication and coordination challenges that required the development of organizational structures capable of managing semi-autonomous operations while maintaining overall coherence of strategy and doctrine. The Syrian branch of the order would eventually develop its own distinctive characteristics and operational patterns shaped by the unique circumstances of the Crusader-era Levant, while remaining connected to the central leadership at Alamut through the networks of communication and authority that linked the scattered components of the Ismaili organization. The circumstances that permitted the establishment of Ismaili territorial holdings in Syria derived from the same pattern of political fragmentation that had created opportunities in Persia, as the death of the Seljuk Sultan Malik Shah in 1092 had produced not only the succession disputes that weakened central authority in Persia, but also the collapse of unified Seljuk control over the Syrian territories. The local rulers who emerged from this fragmentation, governing cities and regions that had previously acknowledged Seljuk overlordship, lacked the resources and coordination to suppress the Ismaili missionary activities that had long operated within their territories, and the arrival of the Crusaders in 1098 added another dimension of complexity to an already fragmented political landscape. The First Crusade had conquered Jerusalem in 1099 and established a series of Latin Christian states along the coastal regions of the Levant, creating new political actors whose presence disrupted existing power relationships and created opportunities that various groups, including the Ismailis, sought to exploit. The chaotic conditions of early 12th century Syria, with Crusader states, local Muslim rulers, and remnants of Seljuk authority all competing for territory and influence, provided the environment within which Ismaili territorial ambitions could be pursued with some prospect of success. The early Ismaili presence in Syria operated primarily through urban missionary networks, rather than the fortress-based territorial model that characterized the Persian organization, with cells of believers and operatives functioning within cities controlled by Sunni rulers, who remained unaware of or unable to suppress the Ismaili activities within their populations. The city of Aleppo became a particularly important center of Syrian Ismaili activity, with the organization achieving significant influence within the city's population and periodic access to political power through alliances with factions competing for control of the city's governance. The pattern of urban infiltration and political manipulation that characterized these early Syrian operations differed from the fortress acquisition strategy that had defined the Persian expansion, reflecting both the different geographic conditions of Syria, which lacked the extensive mountain territories that provided natural fortress sites in Persia, and the different political circumstances that required adaptation of operational methods to local conditions. The periodic massacres and expulsions that Syrian Ismailis suffered when their presence was discovered or when political circumstances turned against them, demonstrated the vulnerability of urban-based operations and eventually drove the Syrian organisation toward the acquisition of fortress holdings that could provide the security that cities could not guarantee. The acquisition of mountain fortresses in the Jabal al-Sumak region, and subsequently in the more defensible Jabal Bara range, provided the Syrian Ismailis with territorial bases comparable to those that the Persian organisation had established in the Alborz Mountains, though the Syrian fortress network never achieved the extent or the natural defensive advantages that characterised the Persian holdings. The castle of Masyaf, which became the most important Syrian Ismaili stronghold and the seat of the organisation's Syrian leadership, occupied a position in the coastal mountains that provided defensible terrain while maintaining proximity to the major political centres of the region, where assassination operations might be directed. The acquisition and fortification of Masyaf and the other Syrian castles transformed the character of Ismaili operations in the region, shifting from covert urban networks toward the territorial model that had proven successful in Persia and providing the organisational base from which the Syrian assassins would conduct the operations that made them notorious throughout the Crusader-era Levant. The relationship between the Syrian and Persian branches of the order involved a complex balance between central authority, emanating from Alamut, and local autonomy exercised by the Syrian leadership in response to the distinctive circumstances of their operating environment. The great distance separating the two organisational centres and the hostile territories through which communications had to pass made detailed direction of Syrian operations from Alamut impractical, requiring the delegation of substantial decision-making authority to the commanders who led the Syrian organisation. This delegation produced a Syrian branch that developed its own operational patterns, its own relationships with local powers, and its own strategic priorities, while remaining connected to the central organisation through acknowledgement of the supreme leadership at Alamut, adherence to the common doctrinal framework, and coordination on matters affecting the broader interests of the Ismaili cause. The balance between unity and autonomy that characterized the relationship between the Persian and Syrian organizations reflected the practical necessities of managing geographically distributed operations in an era when communication delays made centralized control of distant operations impossible, and the Syrian commanders exercised authority that in practice approached independence while maintaining the formal structures of organizational hierarchy that connected them to Alamut. The interaction between the Syrian Ismailis and the Crusader states produced a distinctive pattern of relationships that had no parallel in the Persian context, as the presence of Latin Christian political entities created both new threats and new opportunities that the Syrian leadership had to navigate. The Crusaders represented potential enemies whose religious hostility to Islam in general and whose territorial ambitions posed obvious dangers to any Muslim political entity, including the Ismaili fortresses that occupied territory the Crusaders might covet. Yet the Crusaders also represented potential allies against the Sunni powers, who posed more immediate threats to Ismaili survival, and the fragmented political landscape of Crusader-era Syria created possibilities for tactical cooperation that transcended the religious boundaries separating Christian and Muslim. The Syrian Ismailis developed working relationships with various Crusader entities at different times, including arrangements that provided the order with protection against Sunni attacks in exchange for tribute payments or cooperation against common enemies, while at other times Crusader-Ismaili relations deteriorated into open hostility that produced assassination attempts against prominent Crusader figures. The assassination of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192 represented one of the most consequential and controversial operations that the Syrian assassins ever conducted, demonstrating both the reach of their capabilities and the complex political entanglements that surrounded their activities in the Crusader-era Levant. Conrad had emerged as a central figure in the politics of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem during the period following Saladin's devastating victory at the Battle of Hattin in 1187, which had destroyed the kingdom's military power and resulted in the loss of Jerusalem itself, along with nearly all the major cities and fortresses that the Crusaders had held for almost a century. The arrival of the Third Crusade, led by the kings of England and France alongside the German Emperor, had provided the remaining Crusader presence with the military reinforcement necessary to contest Saladin's conquests, and the prolonged siege of Acre had become the focal point around which Crusader recovery efforts centred. Conrad's role in the defence of Tyre, which had remained in Christian hands when all other major coastal cities fell to Saladin, and his subsequent involvement in the recapture of Acre, had established him as one of the most capable and ambitious leaders of the Crusader enterprise, though his ambitions brought him into direct conflict with other claimants to leadership of the diminished Latin kingdom. The rivalry between Conrad of Montferrat and Guy of Lusignan for the throne of Jerusalem had divided the Crusader leadership during the critical period of the Third Crusade, with Conrad's marriage to Isabella of Jerusalem providing his claim to the crown, while Guy's previous tenure as king and his support from certain factions within the Crusader establishment maintained his competing pretensions. The resolution of this rivalry through Conrad's recognition as king-elect of Jerusalem in April 1192 appeared to settle the succession dispute in his favour, positioning him to lead the reconstruction of the Latin kingdom and to negotiate the terms under which Crusader presence in the Levant would continue following the eventual conclusion of hostilities with Saladin. Within days of this recognition, however, Conrad was dead, struck down by assassins who approached him on the streets of Tyre in the guise of Christian monks and stabbed him with daggers concealed beneath their robes before the king-elect's escort could intervene. The circumstances surrounding Conrad's assassination generated immediate controversy regarding who had commissioned the killing and what motives had driven the operation, with accusations directed at various parties who might have benefited from the elimination of the newly recognised king. Richard I of England, who had previously supported Guy of Lusignan's claim to the throne and who had maintained an often contentious relationship with Conrad throughout the Crusade, faced suspicions that he had arranged the assassination to remove a rival who might have complicated English interests in the Levant, though the evidence for Richard's involvement remained circumstantial and contested by his defenders. Saladin himself was suggested as a possible instigator, given the obvious benefits that Crusader leadership disputes provided to Muslim interests, and the possibility that eliminating Conrad might derail the consolidation of Crusader power that his recognition as king represented. The assassins themselves, when captured and questioned under torture, reportedly provided conflicting accounts of their mission's origins, with some versions implicating Richard, while others suggested different patrons or indicated that the operation had been conducted on the initiative of the Syrian Ismaili leadership for their own reasons. The question of whether the Syrian assassins conducted the operation against Conrad independently or at the behest of an external patron illustrated the complexity of interpreting assassination operations in the political environment of Crusader-era Syria, where the order's services were available to various parties and where the motives for any particular killing might involve multiple factors that defied simple attribution. The Syrian Ismailis had their own reasons to oppose Conrad, who had apparently intercepted an Ismaili merchant ship and confiscated its cargo, creating a grievance that might have motivated retaliatory action regardless of external encouragement. The possibility that the order conducted the assassination to satisfy their own interests, while allowing suspicion to fall on parties like Richard, who might be blamed for the killing, demonstrated the sophisticated understanding of political dynamics that characterized Ismaili operational planning, as the resulting controversy weakened multiple potential enemies regardless of which party bore actual responsibility. The aftermath of Conrad's assassination reshaped the political landscape of the Crusader states in ways that illustrated the strategic significance of eliminating key individuals at moments when their presence was essential to particular political configurations. The succession to the throne of Jerusalem passed to Count Henry of Champagne, who married Conrad's widow Isabella and assumed the position that Conrad had been poised to occupy, fundamentally altering the leadership dynamics of the Crusader enterprise during the critical negotiations that would determine the terms of continued Christian presence in the Levant. The Third Crusade concluded without the recovery of Jerusalem, with Richard III departing the Holy Land in October 1192 under a truce with Saladin that left the Crusaders holding the coastal cities while the Holy City remained in Muslim hands, an outcome that Conrad might have contested or renegotiated had he lived to exercise the authority that his recognition as king would have provided. The demonstration that even a figure as prominent and well protected as the king-elect of Jerusalem could be struck down in the midst of a fortified city reinforced the reputation for reach and effectiveness that the Syrian assassins had cultivated, ensuring that subsequent Crusader leaders would factor the possibility of assassination into their calculations regarding policy toward the Ismaili fortresses. The relationship between the Syrian assassins and Saladin represented a different dimension of the order's operations during the Crusader era. As the great Muslim leader who had unified Egypt and Syria under Ayyubid rule, posed existential threats to Ismaili survival, while also presenting opportunities for tactical accommodation when circumstances favoured cooperation. Saladin's commitment to Sunni orthodoxy and his role as champion of the jihad against the Crusaders made him a natural enemy of the heterodox Ismaili community, whose doctrinal positions were anathema to the religious mainstream that Saladin claimed to represent, and whose fortress holdings occupied territory that Saladin sought to incorporate into his expanding domains. The Syrian Ismailis reportedly attempted to assassinate Saladin on at least 2 occasions, in 1175 and 1176, with assassins penetrating his camp and attacking him directly in operations that came close to success but ultimately failed to kill the Ayyubid Sultan. The assassination attempts against Saladin demonstrated both the capabilities and the limitations of Ismaili operational methods, against a target who maintained effective security measures and who survived the attacks with determination to eliminate the threat that the order represented. Following the failed assassination attempts, Saladin launched a military campaign against the Syrian Ismaili strongholds, besieging the fortress of Masyaf in 1176, with the apparent intention of crushing the order's Syrian presence and removing the threat of further assassination operations. The circumstances under which Saladin withdrew from the siege without capturing Masyaf became the subject of legendary accounts that illustrated the reputation for mysterious capabilities that the assassins cultivated among their contemporaries. According to various versions of the story, Rashid al-Din Sinan, the Syrian Ismaili leader known to the Crusaders as the Old Man of the Mountain, demonstrated his ability to reach Saladin even within his own camp by leaving symbolic warnings that convinced the Sultan that his life remained in danger regardless of military precautions he might take. The legendary elements of the accounts describing Saladin's withdrawal from Masyaf, including tales of Sinan appearing and disappearing mysteriously within the Ayyubid camp, and of warnings delivered in ways that implied supernatural access to the Sultan's presence, reflected the mixture of fact and elaboration that characterized contemporary and subsequent descriptions of Ismaili capabilities. The core reality that Saladin chose to abandon his campaign against Masyaf and subsequently reached an accommodation with the Syrian Ismailis suggested that the order's demonstrated willingness and ability to conduct assassination operations, even against heavily protected targets, made the costs of continued hostility appear to outweigh the benefits of their elimination. The arrangement that apparently followed the lifting of the Masyaf siege established a working relationship between Saladin and the Syrian Ismailis that persisted through the critical years of the conflict with the Third Crusade, with the order's hostility towards certain Crusader figures and their value as a potential threat to Crusader leadership making them useful tacit allies in Saladin's broader strategic objectives. The figure of Rashid al-Din Sinan, who led the Syrian Ismaili organization from approximately 1163 until his death around 1193, embodied the distinctive characteristics that the Syrian branch developed during the period of its greatest independence and operational activity. Sinan's leadership coincided with the most consequential period of Syrian assassin operations, including the assassination attempts against Saladin, the killing of Conrad of Montferrat, and numerous other operations that established the order's reputation among both Muslim and Christian observers. The title by which Crusader sources knew him, the Old Man of the Mountain, reflected both his position as master of the fortress network in the Syrian coastal mountains and the aura of wisdom and esoteric authority that his role as leader of a secretive religious order naturally generated in the imagination of external observers. Sinan reportedly claimed special religious authority during his tenure, including suggestions that he represented the hidden imam or possessed unique access to esoteric knowledge that elevated his status beyond that of a mere regional commander, assertions that created tensions with the central leadership at Alamut, while enhancing his authority among his Syrian followers. The death of Sinan around 1193 and the subsequent reassertion of Alamut's control over the Syrian organization marked a transition in the character of Syrian Ismaili operations, as the independence that Sinan had exercised gave way to closer coordination with the Persian leadership, and a reduction in the dramatic operations that had characterized his tenure. The Syrian assassins continued to maintain their fortress network and to conduct operations against various targets throughout the subsequent decades, but the period of Sinan's leadership represented the high point of their independent significance as a factor in Levantine politics. The relationship between the Syrian organization and the Crusader states continued to evolve through the 13th century, with periods of hostility alternating with arrangements of tactical cooperation as circumstances dictated, though the Syrian assassins never again achieved the prominence they had enjoyed during the era when their operations could determine the succession to the throne of Jerusalem. The operations that the Syrian assassins conducted against Crusader targets beyond Conrad of Montferrat illustrated the range of circumstances that might prompt assassination and the various purposes that such killings served within the complex political environment of the Crusader states. Raymond VII, Count of Tripoli, was killed by assassins in 1152 in circumstances that illustrated the dangers that attempts to subjugate the Ismaili strongholds might provoke. As Raymond's death followed his efforts to assert control over territory where the Syrian Ismailis had established their presence, the assassination demonstrated that Crusader lords who threatened Ismaili interests would face the same retribution that had been directed against Muslim rulers who attacked the order, establishing a pattern of defensive violence that served to deter future aggression regardless of the religious affiliation of potential attackers. The assassination attempts and successful operations against other Crusader figures throughout the 12th and 13th centuries reflected both the order's willingness to strike across religious boundaries and the specific grievances or strategic calculations that prompted particular operations. The killing of Philip of Montfort, Lord of Tyre, in 1270 represented one of the later significant Crusader assassinations, conducted during the period when both the assassin order and the Crusader presence in the Levant were approaching their final decline. The circumstances surrounding this and other Crusader-targeted operations frequently involved disputes over tribute payments, territorial encroachments, or other specific grievances that provided immediate motives for violence, though the broader strategic context of maintaining deterrent credibility also influenced the decision to conduct high-profile assassinations that reinforced the order's reputation for lethal capability. The internal religious development of the Ismaili order during the period following Hassani Saba's death underwent transformations that shaped the doctrinal framework within which assassination operations were understood and justified, while also generating controversies that affected the order's relationships with other Muslim communities. The leadership that succeeded Hassan maintained the basic operational structures and strategic orientation that the founder had established, while developing the religious doctrines that distinguished Nizari Ismailism from other Islamic traditions in ways that became increasingly explicit over time. The declaration of the Qiyamah, or resurrection, by the Ismaili Imam Hassan II at Alamut in 1164 represented a dramatic doctrinal development that proclaimed the end of the era of religious law and the beginning of a new spiritual dispensation in which the external forms of Islamic practice were superseded by direct access to spiritual truth mediated through the Imam. The Qiyamah proclamation transformed the religious self-understanding of the Nizari Ismaili community, providing a doctrinal framework that distinguished them sharply from Sunni Muslims and even from other Shia communities who maintained commitment to Islamic law as the basis of religious practice. The abrogation of the Sharia that the Qiyamah implied, including the suspension of obligatory prayers, fasting, and other religious duties, represented a claim to spiritual authority that other Muslims viewed as heretical in the extreme, confirming and intensifying the religious hostility that had always characterized relations between the Ismailis and the Sunni mainstream. The internal significance of the Qiyamah for the Ismaili community involved complex theological interpretations regarding the nature of spiritual reality and the relationship between external religious forms and inner spiritual truth, while the external significance lay primarily in the sharpening of boundaries between the Ismailis and the broader Muslim world that the proclamation produced. The subsequent history of Ismaili doctrine involved reversals and modifications of the Qiyamah declaration, as later imams restored formal observance of Islamic law while maintaining the underlying theological frameworks that distinguished Nizari Ismailism from other traditions. The grandson of Hassan II, Jalal al-Din Hassan, who ruled as imam from 1210 to 1221, apparently sought reconciliation with the Sunni world by publicly repudiating the more extreme doctrinal positions associated with the Qiyamah and by demonstrating conformity to mainstream Islamic practice, though the sincerity of this apparent conversion remained contested by observers who suspected that taqiyya, the permitted dissimulation of true beliefs under conditions of necessity, explained the outward transformation rather than genuine doctrinal change. The fluctuations in Ismaili doctrinal presentation illustrated the adaptability that characterized the order's approach to relations with the external world, as theological positions could be modified or concealed according to strategic circumstances, while the core commitments to the imam's authority and the community's distinctive identity were preserved through the periods of apparent accommodation. The relationship between doctrinal developments within the Ismaili community and the conduct of assassination operations involved complex questions regarding the religious justification for political violence and the ways in which killing might be understood within the spiritual framework that the order's teachings provided. The commitment to the imam's absolute authority provided the fundamental basis for obedience to commands that might include the killing of designated enemies, as the imam's knowledge of spiritual realities transcended the ordinary moral categories by which violence might be judged. The fidei's willingness to sacrifice his own life in conducting assassination operations reflected a conception of martyrdom that connected individual death in service to the imam with spiritual rewards that made such sacrifice not merely acceptable, but actively desirable within the value framework that the order's teachings instilled. The training and preparation of fides for assassination missions involved the cultivation of attitudes toward death and violence that enabled individuals to conduct operations requiring exceptional courage and commitment, while maintaining the discipline necessary to succeed in missions that might require extended periods of patient waiting before the opportunity for action arose. The legendary accounts of gardens designed to simulate paradise, where potential fidais were given experiences of pleasure intended to motivate their willingness to die in hope of achieving eternal reward, reflected external observers' attempts to explain the extraordinary dedication that Ismaili agents displayed in circumstances where death was the virtually certain consequence of their actions. The actual methods by which the order developed the psychological characteristics necessary for assassination operations likely involved more conventional approaches of ideological formation, religious devotion, and organizational loyalty, though the specific techniques employed within the order's training programs remained opaque to external observers, who could only speculate about the processes that produced such remarkably dedicated operatives. The institutional structures that supported assassination operations at Alamut and throughout the order's fortress network involved sophisticated systems of intelligence gathering, target identification, and operational planning that extended far beyond the dramatic moment of the killing itself. The placement of agents in positions from which they could monitor potential targets and identify opportunities for assassination required the kind of patient intelligence work that might continue for years before conditions favourable for an operation emerged. The coordination between information gathered by agents embedded in target environments and the direction provided by the order's leadership involved communication systems that maintained contact across the distances, separating Alamut from the locations where operations were conducted, though the delays inherent in pre-modern communication meant that agents in the field often had to exercise significant independent judgment regarding the timing and execution of their missions. The record-keeping and historical documentation that the Order maintained at Alamut, including accounts of operations conducted and the circumstances surrounding them, represented an institutional memory that preserved the accumulated experience of assassination as a form of political action across multiple generations of the Order's existence. The library at Alamut reportedly contained extensive records documenting the Order's history and operations, materials that were largely destroyed when the Mongols captured the fortress in 1256, and that subsequent historians have attempted to reconstruct from the fragmentary sources that survived the destruction. The loss of the Alamut archives eliminated the possibility of understanding the Order's operations from the perspective of its own records, leaving subsequent accounts dependent on external sources whose hostility to the Ismaili cause shaped their presentation of events in ways that cannot be corrected against the Order's own documentation. The peak of the Order's territorial extent and operational capability during the late 12th and early 13th centuries represented the culmination of the institutional development that Hassani Saba had initiated, and that his successors had continued across multiple generations of leadership. The network of fortresses that the Order controlled in both Persia and Syria provided territorial bases from which operations could be launched, while the religious community that inhabited these strongholds sustained the human resources necessary for continued organizational activity. The tribute arrangements, the commercial activities, and the agricultural production of the territories the Order controlled provided economic foundations that supported the costs of maintaining fortresses, training operatives, and conducting the intelligence operations that underpinned assassination as a strategic instrument. The transformation of the Order's strategic position during the early 13th century reflected the emergence of new political realities that would ultimately determine the fate of the Ismaili state and the communities it had sustained across more than a century of independent existence. The Khwarezmian Empire that had risen to dominance across the Eastern Islamic world during the decades preceding the Mongol invasions represented a power that the order's traditional methods could neither defeat nor permanently deter, while the fragmentation of authority that had previously allowed the Ismailis to exploit divisions among their enemies gave way to more unified opposition capable of sustained military pressure against the fortress network. The death of the Khwarezm Shah Muhammad II in 1220, following the catastrophic Mongol invasion that destroyed his empire, created a period of chaos across the eastern Islamic lands that temporarily relieved pressure on the Ismaili fortresses while simultaneously introducing the existential threat that would eventually prove fatal to the order's independence. The Mongol forces that swept across Persia under Genghis Khan's generals during the early 12th represented a military power of unprecedented scale and ruthlessness, one that employed methods of warfare and conquest that rendered the defensive strategies the order had developed over generations largely irrelevant to the new strategic environment. The succession of leadership at Alamut during this period of mounting external pressure passed to figures who faced challenges fundamentally different from those their predecessors had confronted during the order's formative decades. Jalal al-Din Hassan, who led the order from 1210 to 1221, initiated a remarkable transformation of the community's public religious position that has generated extensive scholarly debate regarding both its motivations and its authenticity. The proclamation that the Nizari community was returning to Sunni orthodoxy, abandoning the distinctive Ismaili doctrines that had defined the order's religious identity since its foundation, represented either a genuine transformation of belief, a strategic accommodation to political pressures, or an exercise in tasiyya of such thoroughgoing character that it extended to the order's internal religious practice as well as its external presentation. The diplomatic benefits of this declaration included improved relations with the Abbasid Caliphate and reduced religious hostility from the Sunni powers that surrounded the order's territories, while the internal consequences for a community whose identity had been constructed around Ismaili religious beliefs and practices remained difficult to assess given the limitations of available sources. The return to public Ismaili practice under subsequent leaders suggested that whatever the motivations behind Jalal al-Din Hassan's proclamation, the underlying religious convictions of the community had not been fundamentally altered by the period of ostensible Sunni adherence. The leadership of Ala al-Din Muhammad, who succeeded his father Jalal al-Din Hassan in 1221 and ruled until 1255, coincided with the period during which the Mongol threat transformed from a distant concern into an immediate and overwhelming danger. The consolidation of Mongol power across Central Asia and the eastern Islamic lands during the decades following Genghis Khan's death in 1227 created conditions under which the order's independence became increasingly precarious, as the military resources available to the Mongol Khans dwarfed anything the Ismaili fortresses could hope to resist through conventional defensive measures. The tribute payments and diplomatic submissions that Ala al-Din Muhammad offered to various Mongol rulers during his reign reflected attempts to preserve the order's existence through accommodation rather than resistance, though the fundamental incompatibility between Mongol imperial ambitions and continued Ismaili independence meant that such arrangements could provide only temporary respite from the eventual confrontation. The internal governance of the order during Ala al-Din Muhammad's long reign reportedly deteriorated, with sources describing erratic behaviour and periods of incapacity that may have reflected mental illness or the psychological pressures of leading a community facing existential threats it could not effectively counter. The final years of his rule saw mounting tensions within the order's leadership, culminating in circumstances surrounding his death in 1255 that some sources attributed to assassination by members of his own household, though the reliability of such accounts remains uncertain given the biases of the sources that transmitted them. The succession of Rukn al-Din Kushar as the last lord of Alamut in 1255 occurred at the moment when the Mongol forces under Hulagu Khan had already begun their systematic campaign against the order's Persian fortresses. The massive Mongol army that assembled for the conquest of the Ismaili territories represented a concentration of military power that no combination of mountain fortresses and assassination capabilities could hope to counter, while the methodical approach that Hulagu employed in reducing the order's strongholds demonstrated strategic patience that neutralized the defensive advantages the Ismailis had exploited against previous enemies. The initial Mongol operations against outlying Ismaili fortresses during 1256 demonstrated the futility of conventional resistance, as strongholds that had held out for years against earlier sieges fell within days or weeks before the overwhelming force the Mongols brought to bear. The siege engines, the engineering expertise, and the sheer numbers of troops available to Hulagu's army rendered the mountain defences that had protected the order for generations suddenly inadequate against an enemy possessing both the capability and the determination to reduce every fortress regardless of the cost or time required. The negotiations between Rukn al-Din Kursha and the Mongol commanders that preceded the surrender of Alamut reflected the desperate circumstances facing the order's final leader, who sought to preserve the lives of the community through submission, while recognizing that continued resistance would result in the complete destruction of the Ismaili population within the fortress network. The terms offered by Hulagu included assurances of personal safety for Rukn al-Din and his household, provisions for the peaceful surrender of fortresses throughout the order's territory, and implicit promises that the Ismaili community would survive as a subject population within the Mongol domains, even if its political independence and territorial control were permanently eliminated. The decision to accept these terms and order the surrender of Alamut in November 1256 represented the final acknowledgement that the strategic situation facing the order had become hopeless, that the methods of resistance and deterrence that had preserved Ismaili independence for a century and a half had been rendered obsolete by the emergence of an enemy against whom they provided no effective defence. The fall of Alamut to Mongol forces marked the end of the order as an independent political and military entity, though the manner of the fortress's capture and the subsequent treatment of its contents revealed aspects of the Mongol approach to conquered peoples that would shape the fate of the broader Ismaili community. The systematic destruction of the library at Alamut, where the order had accumulated more than a century and a half of religious texts, philosophical treatises, historical records, and operational documentation, represented a catastrophic loss of primary sources that has permanently limited historical understanding of the Nizari Ismaili movement during its formative period. The Mongol historian Juvaini, who accompanied Hulagu's expedition, and whose account provides the most detailed surviving description of the fall of Alamut, reportedly saved certain astronomical and scientific texts from the destruction while consigning the bulk of the library's contents to the flames as heretical materials unworthy of preservation. The selective nature of this destruction reflected Mongol attitudes toward conquered peoples' cultural productions, where practical scientific knowledge might be valued and preserved, while religious and philosophical texts associated with resistance to Mongol authority were eliminated as potential sources of future opposition. The physical destruction of Alamut itself followed the removal of its garrison and the confiscation of its treasures, as Mongol engineers systematically demolished the fortifications that had made the castle virtually impregnable against conventional siege techniques. The mountain stronghold that Hassani Sabah had seized in 1090 and transformed into the centre of a revolutionary religious movement was reduced to ruins that would never again serve as the headquarters of an independent Ismaili state, though the site retained symbolic significance for the Ismaili community that survived the Mongol conquest and continued to venerate the memory of what Alamut had represented. The destruction extended throughout the fortress network that the order had constructed across the Alborz Mountains as Mongol forces methodically reduced stronghold after stronghold in campaigns that continued into 1257 and beyond, eliminating the physical infrastructure that had supported Ismaili independence and territorial control. The fate of Rukn al-Din Kursha following the surrender illustrated the treacherous nature of Mongol diplomacy and the limited value of the assurances that had induced him to capitulate rather than continue resistance. The final Ismaili Imam's initial treatment appeared consistent with the promises made during negotiations, as he was received at Hulagu's court and allowed to travel with a Mongol escort toward the imperial capital at Karakoram, ostensibly to present his submission to the great Khan Monkey in person. The journey eastward across Central Asia ended in Rukn al-Din's execution before reaching his destination, carried out under circumstances that sources describe variously as punishment for the continued resistance of certain Ismaili fortresses that refused to surrender despite his orders, or simply as the elimination of a defeated enemy whose continued existence no longer served Mongol purposes. The death of the last Lord of Alamut extinguished the line of imams that had provided spiritual and political leadership to the Nizari Ismaili community since the schism of 1094, though the subsequent history of Ismaili claims to imamat involves complexities and continuities that extended beyond the destruction of the order's territorial base. The massacre of Ismaili populations that followed the fall of the fortress network represented the systematic elimination of communities that the Mongols apparently determined could not be safely integrated into their imperial system. The inhabitants of surrendered fortresses who had been promised safety found those assurances worthless as Mongol forces conducted widespread killings that reduced the Ismaili population of Persia to a remnant fraction of its former numbers. The scale of destruction reflected both the Mongol approach to peoples who had resisted their authority and perhaps specific concerns about the dangers posed by a community whose methods had included assassination as a political instrument, though the actual threat that disarmed and conquered Ismaili populations could have posed to Mongol rule seems minimal compared to the comprehensive violence deployed against them. The Syrian branch of the order survived the destruction of the Persian fortresses by several decades, its geographic separation from the Mongol conquest of Persia, providing temporary insulation from the fate that had befallen Alamut and its network. The Mongol advance into Syria under Hulagu's forces in 1260, including the capture of the assassin strongholds in the northern reaches of their territory, was halted by the Mamluk victory at Ain Jalut that marked the first significant defeat of a Mongol army in open battle and preserved the independence of Egypt and the Levant from Mongol domination. The Syrian Ismailis subsequently found themselves caught between the Mamluk Sultanate that had inherited Ayyubid authority over the region and the continuing Mongol threat from the east, a position that offered little scope for the independent action that had characterized the order's earlier operations. The gradual submission of the Syrian fortresses to Mamluk authority during the following decades, culminating in the final incorporation of the remaining strongholds in the 1270s, ended the order's existence as an independent political and military force while preserving the Ismaili community as a subject population within the Mamluk domains. The survival of Ismaili communities in the aftermath of the order's destruction, both in Persia and in Syria, ensured the continuation of religious traditions and communal identities that had been formed during the period of the order's independence, even as the institutional structures that had supported that independence were eliminated. The transformation from a militant religious movement capable of independent political and military action into a quietist minority community, practicing its faith under the authority of hostile rulers, represented an adaptation to circumstances that required fundamental changes in the relationship between religious belief and political expression. The doctrine of taqiyya, which had always permitted concealment of true beliefs when necessary for survival, became the dominant mode of Ismaili existence during the centuries following the Mongol conquest, as communities preserved their distinctive religious traditions through private practice, while presenting outward conformity to the majority populations among whom they lived. The legacy of the Order of Assassins in the historical memory of both Islamic and European civilizations reflected the profound impact that the Order's methods had made during its period of active operations, an impact disproportionate to the relatively limited territorial extent of the Order's actual holdings. The word assassin itself, derived from the Arabic hashishiyin through various linguistic transformations as it passed into European languages, became the standard term for political murder in virtually every European tongue, a testament to the association between the Ismaili order and a particular method of violence that had become permanently linked to its name. The accuracy of the derivation from hashish, implying that the order's operatives used cannabis to achieve the psychological states necessary for their missions, remains debated among scholars, with alternative etymologies suggesting derivations from the founder Hassan's name, or from Arabic roots relating to foundational principles, though the hashish connection became firmly established in both popular and scholarly understanding despite its uncertain basis. The narrative traditions surrounding the order that developed in European sources during and after the Crusades combined fragmentary, accurate information about Ismaili beliefs and practices with legendary elaborations that served the purposes of those transmitting them. The story of the old man of the mountain who commanded absolute obedience from followers, willing to leap to their deaths at his word, the gardens designed to simulate paradise that motivated Fides to seek martyrdom, and the extensive network of agents penetrating every court and council became standard elements of European understanding of the order that emphasized its exotic and terrifying aspects while obscuring the more mundane realities of a revolutionary religious movement operating within specific political and theological contexts. The conflation of the Syrian Ismailis, whom Crusader sources primarily encountered, with the Persian headquarters at Alamut, and the broader Nizari movement, created composite images that blended distinct regional traditions into unified narratives that served the purposes of both explaining the order's power and warning of the dangers it represented. The influence of the order's methods and reputation on subsequent political thought and practice extended beyond the mere linguistic contribution of the word assassin to shape understandings of the relationship between religious commitment, political violence, and strategic calculation. The demonstration that a relatively small movement operating from limited territorial bases could project power far beyond those bases through the targeted elimination of key individuals influenced thinking about asymmetric conflict and the vulnerabilities of conventional political authority to unconventional methods. The extensive security measures that rulers throughout the medieval Islamic world developed in response to the Ismaili threat, including the elaborate precautions that Saladin reportedly maintained after surviving multiple assassination attempts, testify to the effectiveness of the order's methods in creating fear that exceeded the actual frequency of successful operations. The romantic and dramatic qualities of the order's history made it a subject of enduring fascination that persisted long after the Ismaili movement had ceased to pose any threat to established political authority. The combination of mountain fortresses in spectacular settings, religious doctrines emphasizing hidden truths accessible only to initiates, methods of political violence conducted with seemingly superhuman dedication, and ultimate destruction at the hands of overwhelming Mongol force provided narrative elements that appealed to successive generations of writers and audiences seeking dramatic material in historical events. The literary treatments of the assassins that proliferated from the medieval period onward, from Marco Polo's influential account through subsequent elaborations and fictionalized versions, established templates for understanding the order that prioritized dramatic effect over historical accuracy, while ensuring that the memory of the Hashashin remained vivid in cultural consciousness. The scholarly reassessment of the Nizari Ismaili movement that developed during the 20th and 21st centuries sought to distinguish the historical reality of the order from the legendary accretions that centuries of hostile and sensationalized accounts had deposited upon it. The recognition that the Nizaris represented a legitimate branch of Shia Islam with sophisticated theological and philosophical traditions that extended far beyond the assassination operations for which they became notorious reframed understanding of the movement as something more than a death cult devoted to political murder. The recovery of Ismaili texts that survived the destruction of Alamut's library, preserved in the libraries of Ismaili communities in Yemen, India, and Central Asia, provided access to primary sources that allowed reconstruction of doctrines and beliefs from the perspective of those who held them rather than solely from the hostile accounts of external observers. The survival of these textual traditions through the catastrophic destruction that Hulagu's forces inflicted upon the Ismaili heartland represented one of the more remarkable examples of documentary preservation in medieval history. With manuscripts carried by fleeing scholars and secreted in remote communities maintaining threads of continuity that would eventually allow modern researchers to reconstruct doctrines that the Mongols had sought to eradicate entirely. The Ismaili communities that persisted after 1256 did so under conditions of extreme vulnerability and deliberate obscurity, practicing taqiyya with a thoroughness born of genuine existential necessity rather than mere strategic convenience, concealing their religious identity behind the external forms of Sunni Islam or Sufi mysticism depending on the dominant traditions of the regions where they found refuge. The transformation of a revolutionary movement that had challenged the foundations of Sunni political authority into scattered communities focused primarily on survival and the preservation of religious knowledge represented a fundamental reorientation that reflected the changed circumstances following the Mongol conquests, rather than any inherent exhaustion of the movement's spiritual or intellectual resources. The Mongol destruction of Alamut and its dependent fortresses proceeded with the systematic thoroughness that characterized Hulagu's operations throughout his western campaign, with engineering expertise deployed to dismantle fortifications that had withstood conventional siege warfare for over a century and a half. The castle of Alamut itself, perched on its rocky prominence above the valley that Hassani Sabah had chosen with such careful attention to defensive requirements, was reduced to ruins that would remain largely unexcavated until modern, archaeological investigations began recovering material evidence of the community that had once inhabited its walls. The destruction of the library that Rukn al-Din had hoped to preserve through his policy of surrender represented a cultural loss whose full dimensions remain impossible to assess. With scientific instruments, philosophical treatises, historical records and theological works accumulated over more than a century and a half of Ismaili intellectual activity, consigned to flames that consumed knowledge that had been assembled from throughout the Islamic world. The Mongol commanders who ordered this destruction operated according to cultural assumptions that valued the practical and the useful over the speculative and the theoretical, showing little interest in preserving intellectual traditions associated with movements they had been dispatched to eliminate, regardless of whatever universal value those traditions might have possessed. The immediate aftermath of the Mongol conquest saw systematic efforts to eliminate surviving members of the Ismaili leadership and to suppress any possibility of the movement's reconstitution as a political and military force capable of challenging Mongol authority. Rukn al-Din Kursha himself, despite his cooperation with Hulagu during the conquest, was executed in 1257 after the Khan determined that the former imam's continued existence posed potential risks that outweighed any benefits his submission might have provided in encouraging the surrender of remaining fortresses. The circumstances of his death, reportedly occurring during a journey to Mongolia, where he had been sent ostensibly to meet with the great Khan Monki, illustrated the limited value of accommodation with Mongol authority for those whose movements had been marked for destruction regardless of their subsequent behaviour. The execution of other members of the Ismaili leadership and the massacre of communities associated with the order throughout the former Nizari territories demonstrated that Hulagu's campaign aimed not merely at military conquest, but at the comprehensive elimination of a movement that Mongol assessments had identified as fundamentally incompatible with the stability they sought to impose upon their newly acquired domains. The Syrian branch of the Ismaili movement, which had operated with substantial independence from Alamut throughout much of its history while maintaining formal recognition of the Persian imam's authority, survived the immediate Mongol conquest that destroyed the Persian centre, but faced its own challenges in the changed political landscape that emerged during the second half of the 13th century. The Mamluk Sultanate that consolidated control over Egypt and Syria following the defeat of the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260 adopted policies toward the Syrian Ismailis that combined toleration of their continued existence with systematic subordination that eliminated their independence as a political and military force. The fortress of Masyaf and other Syrian strongholds that had served as the physical basis for Ismaili power in the Levant passed under Mamluk authority through processes that transformed the formerly autonomous communities into subjects of the Sultanate, obligated to provide military service and tribute in exchange for permission to maintain their religious practices within the constraints that Mamluk supervision imposed. The assassination operations that had made the Syrian Ismailis such feared participants in the politics of the Crusader period ceased under Mamluk rule, whether through explicit prohibition or through the recognition that such methods were no longer compatible with the movement's subordinate status within a political order, capable of crushing any revival of militant activity. The transformation of the Ismaili movement from a revolutionary force, challenging the legitimacy of established political authority to a quietist religious community, focused on spiritual development, and the preservation of esoteric knowledge represented a fundamental reorientation that reflected both external pressures and internal evolution in response to changed circumstances. The concept of satya, or concealment, which Ismaili doctrine had long recognized as an appropriate response to conditions of persecution, became the dominant framework through which communities understood their relationship to the broader societies within which they lived, with the open assertion of distinctive identity giving way to practices of accommodation that allowed survival while maintaining essential beliefs and practices within closed community contexts. The imams who succeeded Rukn al-Din Kursha, their line continuing through descendants who escaped the Mongol destruction, exercised leadership over scattered communities through networks of representatives that operated with the discretion necessary for survival, rather than the public authority that their predecessors had claimed from the fortress of Alamut. The geographic dispersal of Ismaili communities that accelerated following the Mongol conquests created diaspora populations in regions as distant as the Indian subcontinent, where Ismaili missionaries had established footholds during earlier periods and where communities would eventually grow to become the largest concentrations of Nizari Ismailis in the modern world. The centuries that followed the destruction of Alamut saw the gradual development of new patterns of community organisation and religious practice that preserved essential Ismaili doctrines, while adapting to the varied cultural and political contexts within which different community segments found themselves operating. The Ismaili communities of Persia and Central Asia maintained their identity under successive regimes that range from the relatively tolerant to the actively persecutory, developing strategies of survival that included the assumption of Sufi identities that allowed the practice of esoteric spirituality within frameworks that attracted less hostile attention than overt assertion of Ismaili affiliation. The communities of Syria continued under Ottoman rule following the Mamluk period, maintaining their presence in the mountain regions where their ancestors had established the network of fortresses that once projected power throughout the Levantine political sphere. The communities of the Indian subcontinent, particularly those concentrated in the regions of Gujarat and Sindh, developed distinctive cultural and religious expressions that blended Ismaili doctrines with local traditions, while maintaining connections to the Imamate that continued through the descendants of Rukn al-Din despite the dispersal and concealment that circumstances had imposed upon the movement's leadership. The memory of the order's militant past persisted in both internal community traditions and external perceptions that continued to associate the Ismailis with the legendary assassins, whose methods had terrorized medieval rulers. The dual nature of this legacy, combining genuine historical achievements in architecture, scholarship, and community organization with the fearsome reputation acquired through targeted killing, created complex dynamics that Ismaili communities navigated differently depending on their circumstances and the attitudes of the authorities under whose rule they lived. The romantic fascination with the assassins that developed in European culture from the medieval period onward, finding expression in literary and artistic treatments that emphasized the dramatic and exotic elements of the order's history, bore little relationship to the actual circumstances of the Ismaili communities that continued to exist in conditions that prioritized survival and religious preservation over any revival of political or military activism. The gap between the legendary assassins of popular imagination and the real Ismaili communities that carried forward the religious traditions originating in the revolutionary period widened over centuries, during which the movement's militant heritage became increasingly distant from its contemporary reality. The emergence of the Ismaili Imamate from concealment during the 19th century, with the Aga Khan assuming public leadership of the community and eventually receiving formal recognition from colonial and post-colonial governments, marked a new phase in the movement's history that allowed the reconstruction of community institutions and the public assertion of Ismaili identity after centuries of discretion and concealment. The first Aga Khan's receipt of the title from the Persian Shah, and his subsequent relocation to British India following political difficulties with the Qajar government, created conditions that allowed the Imamate to operate openly for the first time since the destruction of Alamut, with access to legal protections and international recognition that the medieval imams operating from their mountain fortress had never enjoyed despite their military power. The transformation of the Imamate from the leadership of a revolutionary movement to the guidance of a diaspora religious community focused on education, economic development, and spiritual cultivation represented a fundamental reorientation that preserved continuity with the doctrinal and genealogical foundations established during the Alamut period, while adapting institutional forms to modern circumstances entirely different from those that Hassani Sabah had confronted when he first ascended the rock of Alamut in 1090. The scholarly reassessment of the Nizari Ismaili movement that developed during the 20th century, drawing upon newly accessible primary sources and approaching the subject with methodological frameworks less influenced by medieval, polemical traditions, fundamentally revised understanding of a movement that had been known primarily through the hostile accounts of its enemies and the legendary elaborations that centuries of retelling had accumulated. The work of historians including Vladimir Ivano, Marshall Hodgson, Farhad Daftari, and others who dedicated sustained scholarly attention to the Ismailis' recovered dimensions of the movement's history that emphasized its theological sophistication, its contributions to Islamic philosophy and science, and its role as a legitimate expression of sheer Islamic spirituality, rather than the death cult of popular imagination. The recognition that the assassination operations for which the order became notorious represented only one aspect of a complex religious and political movement, and that even these operations reflected strategic calculations rather than mere fanaticism. Reframed understanding of the Hashashin in ways that acknowledged their historical significance, while challenging the legendary accretions that had obscured the actual character of their movement. The physical remains of the Ismaili fortress network that once stretched across northern Persia and into Syria provided archaeological evidence that complemented the textual sources through which historians sought to reconstruct the material conditions of life within the order's strongholds. The excavations at Alamut conducted during the 20th century revealed traces of the community that Hassani Saba had established, including architectural features, ceramic remains, and other artifacts that testified to the sophisticated organization of a settlement that combined military functions with religious and intellectual activities. The fortress sites scattered across the Alborz Mountains and the Syrian coastal ranges, many reduced to ruins, but retaining enough structural integrity to indicate the engineering achievements of their builders, demonstrated the scale of investment that the Ismaili movement had made in creating defensible bases from which to pursue its revolutionary objectives. The spectacular settings of many of these fortresses, perched on rocky prominences that combined natural defensive advantages with dramatic visual impact, contributed to the romantic fascination that the order continued to inspire long after its power had been broken and its political significance reduced to historical memory. The influence of the assassins on subsequent thinking about political violence, secret societies, and the relationship between religious commitment and strategic calculation extended far beyond the immediate historical context within which the order operated, establishing templates and terminology that continued to shape understanding of these phenomena centuries after the destruction of Alamut. The demonstration that targeted killing of key individuals could serve as an effective instrument of political strategy, compensating for conventional military weakness through the psychological impact of dramatic eliminations, influenced thinking about asymmetric conflict that found application in contexts entirely removed from the medieval Islamic world, where the Nizaris developed their methods. The organizational models that the order pioneered, combining hierarchical authority structures with decentralized operational cells capable of acting independently while maintaining loyalty to distant leadership, provided precedents that subsequent movements organized for clandestine purposes would consciously or unconsciously emulate. The symbolic power that the assassins acquired, representing the possibility that even the mightiest rulers might fall to determined individuals motivated by belief rather than material interest, invested the order with significance that transcended its actual historical achievements, and ensured its continued prominence in cultural imagination long after the movement itself had ceased to pose any threat to established authority. The legacy of Hassani Saba and the order he founded thus operated on multiple levels, encompassing the continued existence of Ismaili religious communities that preserved and developed the doctrinal traditions originating in the revolutionary period, the influence on political and strategic thought that the order's methods and organization exercised, and the cultural fascination that the legendary assassins continued to inspire through their combination of dramatic setting, mysterious beliefs, and spectacular methods. The transformation from revolutionary movement to diaspora religious community, from militant order to peaceful congregation focused on spiritual development and worldly welfare, represented not a betrayal of the founder's vision, but an adaptation to circumstances that made the methods and objectives of the Alamut period no longer appropriate or achievable. The Ismaili communities of the contemporary world, numbering in the millions and distributed across multiple continents under the leadership of the Aga Khan, maintained connections to the heritage of the Hashashin while embodying forms of religious expression and community organization that Hassani Saba, surveying the world from his mountain fortress, could scarcely have imagined. The historical significance of the Nizari Ismaili movement during its revolutionary phase lay not merely in the assassination operations that made it famous, but in the demonstration that a minority religious community, operating from limited territorial bases against vastly more powerful opponents, could survive and even thrive through a combination of strategic intelligence, disciplined organization, and the exploitation of vulnerabilities that conventional political and military analysis tended to overlook. The fortress network that the Nizaris constructed and defended represented a physical expression of their determination to create spaces within which their understanding of Islam could be practiced and transmitted despite the hostility of surrounding powers committed to their elimination, and the longevity of this network testified to the effectiveness of the strategies through which they pursued their objectives. The theological and philosophical productions of the Alamut period, though largely destroyed by the Mongols, survived in sufficient quantity to demonstrate that the movement generated intellectual achievements of genuine sophistication rather than merely the fanaticism that hostile sources attributed to it. The combination of military innovation, organisational effectiveness, and intellectual production that characterised the Nizari movement during its century and a half of independence from Alamut established a legacy that extended far beyond the dramatic assassinations for which the order became notorious in both Islamic and European traditions. The destruction of the order by Mongol forces that swept across the Islamic world during the 13th century placed the Nizari experience within the broader context of the catastrophe that transformed political, cultural and religious life throughout the regions affected by Mongol conquest. The fall of Alamut preceded by only 2 years the fall of Baghdad and the execution of the last Abbasid caliph, events that marked the end of political structures that had organised Islamic life for centuries and created conditions within which new forms of authority and organisation would eventually emerge. The Ismailis, despite the apparent completeness of their defeat, demonstrated greater resilience than the caliphate itself, with their movement surviving in transformed form while the institution that their ancestors had challenged disappeared entirely from history, except as a nominal title claimed by later rulers seeking legitimacy through association with the Islamic past. The persistence of Ismaili communities through the centuries following the Mongol destruction, maintaining their distinctive beliefs and practices despite persecution and marginalization, testified to the strength of the bonds that Hassani Sabah and his successors had forged between religious conviction and community identity. The word that the Crusaders carried back to Europe, transformed through their languages into assassin, became the most enduring contribution of the order to world vocabulary, investing the concept of targeted political killing with associations derived from the methods and reputation of the medieval Ismailis. The trajectory of this term from the specific designation of a particular religious movement to the generic description of any politically motivated killer illustrated the process through which historical specificity dissolved into universal categories, with the distinctive context of the Nizari movement giving way to abstract concepts applicable across cultures and periods entirely removed from the conditions that produced the original phenomenon. The legacy of the Hashashin in contemporary usage thus operated largely independent of any actual knowledge of the historical order, with the word assassin carrying connotations of stealth, treachery, and cold-blooded calculation that reflected the legendary reputation rather than the complex reality of the movement from which it derived. The transformation of historical actors into archetypal figures, their specific circumstances and motivations subordinated to the narrative functions they served in subsequent retellings, represented a common fate for dramatic episodes that captured imagination, while resisting the nuance and qualification that historical accuracy required. Hassani Sabah had ascended to his fortress in 1090 with a vision of transforming the Islamic world through the recognition of the true Imam and the overthrow of illegitimate authorities that had usurped power rightfully belonging to the descendants of Ali. The movement he founded had survived his death, and continued for over a century and a half to challenge the political and religious establishment of the Sunni world from positions that seemed impregnable until forces from the distant steppes arrived with capabilities against which no fortress could stand. The Mongols who destroyed Alamut had themselves been destroyed as a unified empire, their domains fragmenting into successor states that eventually gave way to new political formations that would reshape the Islamic world according to patterns entirely different from those that either the Abbasid Caliphate or its Ismaili challengers had envisioned. The Ismaili communities that survived all of these transformations, carrying forward the doctrines and loyalties that link them to the revolutionary period, while adapting to circumstances that made the methods of that period no longer viable, represented living testimony to the persistence of religious conviction across historical ruptures that destroyed states and empires, while leaving faith communities to navigate whatever worlds emerged from the wreckage. The fortress of Alamut, reduced to archaeological traces on a mountain that overlooked the valleys through which merchants and armies had passed for millennia, retained its power to evoke the era when a small community of believers had challenged the foundations of medieval Islamic political order, from a stronghold that seemed to touch the heavens themselves. The library that once contained the accumulated wisdom of the Ismaili tradition existed only in the fragments that escaped destruction, supplemented by texts preserved in distant communities and gradually recovered by scholars seeking to understand what the flames had consumed. The Fideus who once trained within those walls, preparing for missions that might end their earthly lives while promising rewards in the paradise that Ismaili doctrine taught awaited the faithful, had passed from historical actors into legendary figures whose deeds grew more dramatic with each retelling across the centuries that separated the medieval order from its modern interpreters. The Old Man of the Mountain, whether understood as Hassani Saba himself or as a composite figure blending the characteristics of successive leaders into a single archetypal image, continued to haunt the imagination of those drawn to stories of secret power exercised from hidden strongholds by men whose faith made them capable of actions that ordinary calculations of self-interest would have prevented. The story of the Hashashin demonstrated that history remembered what it chose to remember, selecting from the complexity of actual events those elements that served the purposes of subsequent generations, while allowing other dimensions to fade into obscurity that only specialized scholarship could partially illuminate. The assassinations that made the Order famous represented only the most dramatic manifestation of a movement that also built fortresses, cultivated gardens, copied manuscripts, developed philosophical systems, and maintained communities of believers across territories that stretched from Persia to Syria. The destruction that ended the Order's independence erased much of the evidence that would have allowed fuller understanding of these other dimensions, leaving the assassination operations to dominate historical memory because they had been documented by sources whose hostile attention ensured their preservation, even as more sympathetic accounts perished with the libraries that housed them. The scholarly recovery of the Ismaili perspective on their own history, incomplete though it necessarily remained, provided counterweight to traditions of understanding shaped entirely by those who had viewed the movement as an existential threat requiring elimination, rather than a legitimate expression of religious aspiration deserving comprehension on its own terms. The Order of Assassins had risen from a single fortress, seized, through stratagem rather than siege, expanded to control a network of strongholds scattered across the mountains of two regions, projected power through methods that made the mightiest rulers fear for their lives, survived for over a century and a half against opponents who vastly exceeded its conventional military resources, and finally fallen to forces representing a transformation of warfare that no fortress could withstand. The movement that survived the fall adapted to circumstances that made its militant heritage a memory rather than a program, preserving the religious core while abandoning the methods that had made it feared throughout the medieval world. The communities that carried this heritage into the modern era, their millions of members distributed across continents under the guidance of an imamate that traced its authority back through the chaos of the Mongol destruction to the revolutionary vision of Hassani Saba, represented the living continuation of a tradition that had demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of asymmetric resistance to overwhelming power. The word that remained, transformed into every European language and exported to tongues that had never encountered the medieval order, carried forward the memory of a movement that had shown the world how the dedicated few might strike at the powerful many, a lesson that subsequent centuries would have cause to remember in circumstances that the Old Man of the Mountain, gazing out from his fortress over valleys that stretched toward a future he could not see, would never have recognized but might perhaps have understood.